12 miles below. By Mark Arrows. Chapter 181 Book 4 and Chapter 192. Book 4, Chapter 41, Combined Arms. A foreign soul link curled from the necklace, connecting with my own, bridging a small gap. Keith. Father said, tone cold and clear. What he didn't say was the relief deep inside that I hadn't fallen off the edge. The simmering fury inside him at watching anyone attempt to harm his family again. Worry for Kedra. Pride that we'd both held our own against a threat, and vicious satisfaction that Tisefit had been outright executed. As quickly as those thoughts inadvertently passed through the link, a wall of his will slammed between us, holding the rest of his thoughts guarded behind. Just you in there? I asked, politely leaving his thoughts alone. There wasn't a sign of any other knight within the necklace. Only his soul fractal glowed with power, the rest inside the necklace remained empty. The others remained behind of their own choice, within the armor's reserve soul fractals. I was left behind. You need more help than the captain. And in case I didn't survive, I had one more possible escape from death. But that part wasn't mentioned, only implied. Evelis came to a stop, hand holding onto the chain hilt, other hand lifting up. I'll offer you terms one last time. Eyes locked on the neck piece, calculating new ways to get under my skin. I can supply you with armors, weapons, food, medicine, shelter, peace. Whatever you need for your clan and family's well-being. Location data of suitable places with new pillars that could become a new home for your people. I could even delete those parts off the machine maps, obscure whatever location you select. I could watch over it myself over distances, making sure the territory is never logged again so long as I live. Step out of the way, allow me to recover to Wrath, and this all ends for the best. Deleting your own maps and then actively hiding a human population sounds like something a traitor would do, you know. I said, tapping a foot in the rushing water. How do I know you're not just going to stab me in the back the moment I hand over Wrath's head? I could see Wrath's working eye flicker straight over to me from her sack, a look of betrayal in them even with the rest of her face frozen over. I waved her worries away, hoping she'd get the message. I just needed to buy time. Kedra's combat feed showed she was using the disappearance of Evelis as a window of opportunity to hunt down and destroy his surrounding forces. Given how Evelis stood still further away from me, the feather must have already written them off from the moment he'd come here. By the time he'd get back to them, Kedra would have finished the last one. The break Tisefit had given her to catch a breath had been well used. My goals are only to complete my mission, he said, eyes focused, trying to calculate what order of words would convince me the best. My actions, for or against mankind, will be meaningless in the ultimate scope of this conflict. What is one more city of humans hiding under her gaze? Granting you these offers cost me nothing, I have no reason nor motive to go against my word. Journey's HUD lit up with signals, more nameplates appeared under our slowly dwindling team. The away team was battering down doors and choke points, distant rifle sounds echoing, barely audible over the din. Choose. Evelis said. End this all now, or die trying. Well, if you put it like that, guess I'll die. He sighed, more annoyed than anything. An unfortunate answer. The chain in his hand began to swing. This could have been far easier on everyone. Never said I'd make it easy. I said, a cult pulsing around me, mirror images flying directly in his path. He tutted, sprinting forward and eliminating the ghosts with impressive grace, the chain moving around like an extension of his shell. I tried to manipulate the images earlier, before he'd reached to dispatch them, but that chain had God's damned reach. In moments, I needed to make use of my own solid shield and sword to keep alive as the weapon swung right into me. Fighting against a ranged whip was unlike anything I'd ever done before. The arm's shield would block the chain, but it would start to wrap around unless I shoved the whole thing up fast enough while also sidestepping away from the blow to help deflect it, forcing the chains to slip off and continue the trajectory above my head. And I had to keep an eye on that mace end, or he'd blast me out of the way. Those I needed to outright dodge perfectly. Worse was the pot shots he took at Wrath's sack, forcing me to constantly kick her backwards as I gave ground and held him off. Collision with occult images I sent out also ran into an issue. If the chain edge struck against their arm's healed edges, the images didn't have enough stopping power to remain manifested. They vanished into mist, not even slowing the swing down or dealing any kind of damage. Even if I got an image close enough to swing at him that he hadn't been able to take on, I knew he could just turn translucent and let the image swing through. Functionally invulnerable. This was a race to the bottom and I knew it. I still battered his attacks away, again and again. He changed the pattern up, twisting on himself and slamming the mace part into the water before me at an angle. Rocks and a spray of water cracked out into chunks behind an occult pulse. They flew right into my position, pummeling me with hundreds of smaller chunks. Journey's HUD was a mess, readjusting to the lowered visibility as quickly as it could. Shields hadn't triggered, but the larger rock chunks shoved me slightly off position. The occult sight remained clear even if my physical ones weren't. And within it, I saw death. Particles of black swirling dust, appearing in a graceful arc, where a chain would swing through my neck. I ducked. Ivalis's chain scythed harmlessly above, death dissipating. He might have actual invulnerability, but I had something similar. Father's perception, and he was right there connected with me. The mist didn't stop him from executing further movements. He redirected the chain, and I barely deflected it downwards with the arms healed, slamming the whole thing down into the ground and putting my weight on it, trying to pin it down. That wasn't a good idea. Scratch that, it was a terrible idea. A cold pulsed at the mace end and I was tossed off the chain, fumbling forward into the water. Journey's HUD showed even more damage to my bones and muscles, parts going orange this time. No time to think about that. I rolled back on my feet in panic, sprinting straight for Wrath's exposed sack, watching as his chain already carved through the air, going straight down for her head. I reached her in the nick of time, my sliding kick knocking her sack away just as the mace end crushed into the ground right where my boot had flashed past. It exploded again, spraying water and rock in every direction, tossing both myself and Wrath's sack backwards. I scrambled back up on my feet, avoiding Ivalis's follow-up murder attempts by the skin of my teeth, abusing the occult sight for everything I could get. Death came at me again and again. He tried to go for Wrath after the failures, but my blade desperately swiped through the air with a short jump, catching his own chain and throwing it off course. The weapon rattled and returned back to his hilt. Ivalice paused, a haze of air above his head reaching past his halo. Violet eyes glared at me the entire time. Contemplating. I didn't have any time to strap Wrath back on my back, but so long as I remained standing, he wasn't getting to her. And Ivalice knew that. The end of the whip is the weak point. Father said in the intermission, watching the lopsided fight. It can be sliced by an occult blade at the right angle. The chain end was more like a diamond mace, with each fanged edge glowing bright occult blue. But unlike the chain itself, there were still openings in between the fangs. Easy for you to say, I'd need to thread a needle in a snowstorm to pull that off. You lack the skill. The crusader in your armor does not, and will not be held down by human reflex. Order her. Journey had turned off the administrator override for remote operation during the reset, and I hadn't turned it back on since. Tuekar had been able to brute force his way into controlling my armor if I did leave the doorway open, but that was Tuekar. Ivalice might not know that was possible. Wrath had deleted as much information as she could. Getting Journey to move with me could be the piece that turns the tides, or it could equally damn me in the same moment. Can't unlock her here. I need to give a verbal command, and feathers are the world's best eavesdroppers. He'll hear me under my helmet and start putting pieces together. How about you? You're here, Wrath once tapped into your experience. Can't you send it my way somehow? He didn't answer immediately, mulling it over. It is possible, although it may come at a price. The girl had software protecting her identity from being tainted by my own and a soul fractal variation made to jail souls instead of housing them. The cage was built for it. Sagrius showed what happens when two souls connect on a deeper level without guard. One is eroded away, either your armor or myself. But, should the stakes grow dire, I will intercede. For now, take what chances come your way. Chance in this case had a name. Kedra, and she was here to finish what she'd started. A screamer's dead shell was hurled across the battle, more a statement than part of any real plan. Ivalice easily hopped up on the dorsal spines as the unmoving machine slid against the ground where he'd stood. The rest of his army lays in ruins now. Kedra said, walking into view from the mist. Her swords flourished, splattering droplets of black oil off the flat edges. He's alone. Options. That invulnerability has got to go. And he's been using it sparingly, which means there's a limit. I think we need to grapple him. My voice caught me by surprise. I was starting to slur a bit, only realizing now how much my thoughts had begun to feel fuzzy without my notice. Overuse of the mirror fractal, or all the throwing around had caused a concussion at some point. It's fine, all we had to do was eliminate him. Like Kedra had said, just one more target to take down. She nodded at the plan, hunching down for a sprint. Evelus had clearly heard our talk, and given his reaction, I think the grapple plan was on the right path. He leaped straight up from the screamer's dead shell, far into the air where we wouldn't be able to get him. With a muttered curse, I readied my weapons again, a cult pulsing around as the mirror fractal flared into life once again. You think we can't catch you in the air, yo? Death bloomed around me, stretched out like a four-fingered hand, wrapping around my chest, arms, and neck. All connected by a straight line of death from the apex of his jump. So thick, it seemed to cover my entire sight. Belatedly, I realized he hadn't jumped out of fear. He was looking for a very specific angle. One where he could draw a straight line through me, and wrath. Death reached far behind me, a tendril of darkness slashing through her sack. With clarity that cut through my blurry mind like fire, I knew exactly what was coming. I abandoned my mirror images, turned and yanked her sack, leaping to my side, landing hard on my shoulder with absolutely no grace and a deep splash of water. Evelus threw something at the same instant with all the force in his arm. A small black spinning cylinder, spiked straight at a target with unerring precision. A Nightbreaker round. My Nightbreaker round. Freshly stolen earlier, now returned to sender. The speed was ridiculous. Probably the upper limit a Nightbreaker round could withstand without crushing the round faster than the chains could destroy something. He must have calculated that. The round narrowly missed my chest, smashing into the water behind me where Wrath had just been. A massive angled geyser flashed out from the round's impact, chains expanding out and ripping apart everything around it. I dodged it. Journey's shield still triggered for some reason. Then instantly overloaded. And I realized I hadn't completely dodged it. One of the chains had been close enough to reach me. I watched it through the soul trance in almost morbid fascination. It licked my leaping leg for only a moment, wrapping around my ankle, sliding off the shield, slowly unwrapping off. Just as it nearly cleared away, the shield broke apart, letting the chain sink teeth into my calf and heel as a parting gift. A small nick. Journey's structural integrity showed instant failure through the boot portion, backup synthetic muscles now taking the load instead. Medical scans showed my body hadn't done any better against a chain. It had slashed straight through ligaments and muscles alike, before whipping away and descending down into the rock with the rest of its cursed kin. They all gouged deep funnels into the floor, and turned off. The now unpowered chains were stuck inside the ground, anchoring the weapon against the shallow river trying to carry it off into the maelstrom. I got back on my feet, my right boot carrying scarlet-dyed water off and away with the current. Needed to seal that wound fast, next chance I got. Trying to kill me with my own ordnance. I said, with bravado I definitely didn't feel. He very narrowly had. Suffocate claimed the same to you a moment ago. It didn't end well for her, although you fared through it better. At least it provided some additional data, it wasn't a complete waste. He said, landing nearer to the whirlpool edge. Glad you learned throwing things at me doesn't work. What's the next plan, Evelus? Asking me to look away first. His eyes narrowed at that. Human reflexes alone wouldn't have saved you. Your attempts to mislead aren't as subtle as you think. It's clear to me sight wasn't the deciding factor. You're using a fractal of some kind to predict attacks. It's God's damned hard to successfully lie to a feather. Especially one that's trying to ferret info out of me like this. How about you come closer and find out? I said, settling for a neutral reply that wouldn't give him anything else to work on, tapping deep into the mirror fractal again, ignoring the budding headache it was causing. Kedra sprinted directly to his position, blades ready for another bout against him. Occult mirrors sent out from myself were equally about to slam into him from the other side. The feather didn't move. Eyes shifting between me and Kedra, back and forth. Calculation. Conclusion. He nodded to himself, as if everything was going as expected. Then wordlessly took a step backwards and the whirlpool behind swallowed him whole. There wasn't a trick to it. I could see him in the occult sight, even beyond visual range. The concept of a feather fell down in free fall, until he vanished from my range. The rat bastard had run off. Book 4, Chapter 42, Rest Before the Storm. He ran. Kedra hissed, sliding to a stop with a heavy splash of water. He ran. I confirmed, the occult sight showing me nothing but darkness below the whirlpool. The feather may have only made you think he's run. Father warned, voice crackling on the comms. An enemy like that one is relentless. Don't be fooled. Got to agree with the old man. He's making a new plan. He's definitely making a new plan, the bastard. I said, taking a few cautious steps to the whirlpool edge. Current one is a bust, he's down an army and 2 feathers. He can't track us anymore, and... In the distance, more rifle shots echoed, getting closer. And we've got our own army that's caught up. No wonder he decided running was the better choice. Must have known his time was up. The nightbreaker round he'd chucked at me had been a last attempt to finish us off without wasting more time. All things said and done, I was happy enough with this result. The headache and difficulty concentrating was slowly bleeding away now that I wasn't tapping the occult every second. I'd gone very close to my limits, now I was paying the belated price. Which would have been terrible had the fight continued on. The battle was over. All that was left were limping machines that hadn't yet been completely executed by Kedra, and while they were screeching incoherently at me, my sister had her blade ready to stab anything that dragged itself too close. Not that they'd have the chance to do even that. I let my body flop down on the ground, arms spread out, letting water wash over the armor. Imagining I was back home in the safety of the clan, and all this was the warm waters of the communal bathhouse. Couldn't feel any of it through journey of course, but it's the thought that counts. It helped me nurse the headache that had somehow followed me even into the soul trance. In the surrounding perimeter, 4 blurs of silver and red streaked straight through ahead of the group behind them. They leaped out of the tunnels, deep into the air, each landing hard against the rushing water, rifles drawn out. Scanning the area. Spotting us a moment later. The 4 knights turned and began a rapid jog directly our way, blades cutting through limping shells of machines Kedra had only incapacitated. Killing blows delivered with savage strikes, even as the near-dead screamers tried to swing and fight back. No rifle shots. No need to waste bullets on the scraps left behind. The 4 Winterscar knights didn't even give them the courtesy of looking as they scythed through the scattered machines between them and us. In mere moments, 4 Winterscar knights surrounded Kedra and me, the soldiers taking defensive positions on all sides, while the rest of the clan knights fanned around the chamber. We greet the prime. One said to Kedra, giving a blade salute, with a bow. She returned it with all the regal bearing of a house prime. The others had their helmet fixed straight on where I lay. Medical scans from the armor would have already told all 4 I was still alive. Not good to play a few more rounds of hanger ball alive. More like lucky to limp around alive. My vitals were showing a grim picture. The kind that would mean if I ever stepped out of the soul trance, pain would very quickly come after me like I owed it money. Good thing I could hide from it all in the soul trance. The captain. One of my knights asked, helmet turning to scan the surroundings. Sounds of blades slicing through leftover enemies echoed through the chamber as the rest of the surface knights fully breached into the chamber uncontested. His armor fell into the whirlpool, to the second strata. Father said over the comms. Enemy prevented recovery. The other knights remain with him, holding his soul safe for now. They stayed quiet for a moment, helmets turning to one another. One took a step forward, looking down at me. We can recover him once we've secured your safety, my lord. The captain would understand. Lord Atius. One of the clan knights asked, coming closer to our group. I recognized the insignias and decorations as a knight of House Isastride. And given the old dry tone, this had to be the prime. Highly respected warrior, with decades of service. During the time that father had lost his mind, the one who had come closest to challenging Shadow Song for the title of First Blade had been him. He's gone. I said, pointing to the melted rocks above, where the clan lord had made his last stand to Sefit. The knight nodded. We will reunite on the surface. And Master Windrunner. Also deceased. Armor and all. Same enemy. Couldn't get to him in time. The words hurt to say or even think. Windrunner was just gone. I could tell the news hit the knights hard, even if none of them reacted to it outwardly. Isastride shook his head. He will be remembered. The time for mourning must come later. For now, chain of command continues with me, in the absence of the clan lord. The knights sent acknowledgement pings, each name lighting up with a green dot on Journey's HUD. All except for the names in grey. I sent my confirmation ping with the rest. Debrief. Isastride asked, helmet turning to Kedra. She sheathed her sword back into place, going over the abridged events while the rest of the clan knights secured the chamber. Isastride nodded slowly. I see. The Might Forge is no longer on this level, and is further under us. The final enemy is also unaccounted for, likely fallen back to guard that objective. And we have an incoming wave of machines on our heels. The original forces this feather expected to have more time to summon. Should we retreat? I asked. Wrath remained silent in the sack, watching events. No, Isastride said, shaking his head slowly. There is only complete victory, or eventual defeat. Consider it, Winterscar. Might forges are not hidden, the machines know where each one is and has armies surround them. If your nemesis was kicked to the ground, would you let her get back up with such an advantage to pull from? I shook my head. Not a chance. I'd guard every Might Forge nearby and set up alerts everywhere else in case she tries to find another forge further off. I'd have armies surround every point of interest and probably hound after her every second of the day. I'd never give her the chance to repair or rest. Correct. And I suspect that's exactly what the enemy has done. Had we gone for further forges away, we would have encountered fully entrenched armies. And, worse, the original feather we were sent to take down, Tuekar, knew about the clan enough to hunt you down there. Had you not gone out to the fields to confront the chosen knights, Tuekar would have gone into the clan colony and slaughtered his way to your house gates. What does that tell you? They know where we live. I gulped. Which means he knows where we live too. He nodded. I admit I find it strange that their leader can't understand the surface exists, but I can't fault the scheme when considering it from a long-term position. Any machine that tries to continue the campaign on the surface would eventually be destroyed by relinquished herself in a fit of fury. Over time, only the ones who do not touch the surface will remain. Tuekar showed the best machines can do on the surface, given that limit. It wasn't as dire as it could have been. He did have an entire machine army, along with Wrath following his orders at that point. And instead of swinging that like a battering ram into the clan gates, he'd gotten the Othersiders to do the war for him, while his real army handled the Undersiders. I got where Isastride was going with this. Evelis will do the same against the clan. If we bring back Wrath like she is now, he'll keep sending slavers and raiders to batter the clan down. He'll hold the entire clan's safety as a hostage. He nodded. You won't be able to shelter Wrath under our banner, not in her vulnerable state. Assassins and other sabotage would likely be the weapon of choice. The mission must continue, to the end. Wrath must be repaired, or we cannot bring her back with us. He took a step forward to the whirlpool, looking down. And Tuevelis knows it. That was, a little hard to take in. If Wrath wasn't repaired and we retreated back home, Tuevelis would follow behind like a bloodhound smelling weakness. With her repaired, he wouldn't be able to make such overt moves, since she'd be able to fight off anything herself. Wrath might be still learning common sense, but she wasn't lacking in combat. She'd killed Tisefit alone, and would likely outright counter Tuorda's gravity manipulation with her wings. If she's fixed up, she'd easily rip apart any Othersiders or assassins he had to work with. The only thing that could threaten her at that point would be a full machine army, and he couldn't field those on the surface. Evelis would have to wait for us to leave the clan on our own rather than pick a fight when we had all advantages lined up. The path down is one way, Kedra said. We jump in, we won't be able to get back up. How long would we need to travel in the second strata to return to the drop-off point? Isastride said nothing, helmet fixed on the whirlpool in front of him. Weeks. And with the Undersider city destroyed, there would be no other gathering point we could find. But it seems the gods have some favor for us after all. Skin below the whirlpool. Our intel doesn't seem up to date. Something is down there, where there should be nothing. Kedra walked closer to the vortex, helmet pointing down. Journey was already downloading what was being scanned by Isastride. A hand reached out ahead of me, one of my knights. I took it, and let it drag me back up on my feet, water washing down Journey. No rest for the wicked looked like. So while everyone else was busy unloading hover sleds, getting ammo deposits set up for quick loading, pushing machine scraps into piles, or staring down the whirlpool at the center for the secrets it hid under, I made my way to one particular troubled spider we'd come all this way to help. She stared at me as I made my way, expression unreadable since nothing worked in her shell other than that single glowing eye. Once I made contact again, feelings and words came into my mind. Were you worried about me? I asked. No. She answered back immediately. If she were able to move, she'd be huffing, arms crossed, likely looking away. It's adorable how bad at lying you are. You really should be a little more honest with your feelings. You were able to defeat me before. If you had failed against Tuovilus, I would have been greatly disappointed. I was not worried. Not in the slightest. She had been. Quite a lot. No hiding any of that in the soul sight. Some reasons were a little touching. She considered me a close friend. Other reasons were a little disturbing. Apparently the only one allowed to kill me was her. Tuovilus doing it before she could was encroaching on her turf, and she was not a happy spider about that. She was worried he'd rob her of something rightfully hers. She didn't have any intention of killing me, anytime soon, or at all. But it was the idea of someone else getting to me first that she found very ill-tasting. Feathers. I sighed. Even the good ones are crazy. Your thought patterns are just as strange to me, human. She tutted back. Equally confused as to why I hadn't thought of fighting her to the death again either. If anything, she found it insulting. As if I considered myself too far above her to even think her a threat. Once my shell is repaired, I would appreciate if you considered me with due respect. I gave her a level stare, then reached out with a hand to shove her back into the sack. All right, back in you go, little Miss Murderbot. Reflect on how killing people isn't socially acceptable in this day and age. Wrath squawked in protest, but had no way to stop the terrible evil human from lifting her up. She'd changed a lot over time. At one point, all she had as examples to follow were Feather and Tuekar. Now her world was far more broad, filled with different people to learn from. She'd found her own voice here, slowly turning into someone more attuned with who she wanted to be. We'll need to get you new straps. Old ones are busted, I said, turning to one of the knights further off. Fortunately, broken straps were something that happened often, and Kedra had considered that we'd run into this issue. One of the hover sleds brought with the clan knights had everything I'd need to replace the straps, with some careful knots. Don't think I haven't noticed your own thoughts, human. You really should be a little more honest with your feelings. She said, smug about throwing my own words right back at me. Well now, aren't you holding your head a little high for someone stuck in a sack? I'll be billing you for all these extra straps once we're done here, and I'm going to overcharge for everything I can squeeze. I'm a Winterscar, we have a reputation to keep. And I'll negotiate with Kedra on those, as she is the head of your house. And far more reasonable. As I was working on this, Isastride had ordered the small army assembled here to take positions around the chamber, sending Anka and the Shadow Songs further up the central tower to get a vantage point outside, while the rest of the knights took over fortifications Ivalis had once made to keep us out. A few others were already setting down and taking out rations, eating while they could. This was the first break they'd had in hours, and it wasn't known when they'd get another moment. A more complete map had started to fill out with the armors working together, sharing knowledge acquired of what lay hidden under the whirlpool. If the desert strata was a full mile down, these armors had excellent range to be able to scan through metal-filled water like this. They were able to get data. Not because they had mile-long sensor abilities, but because what was under us wasn't a desert. A mite colony must have passed through at some point. Kedra said, watching as the map was being filled out, even against the water causing half the sensor pings to return garbage junk. Rectangles jutted up from the ground, massive structures, like towers. Fuzzy, lines shifting a few dozen times in quick succession as the armors filtered through what was real and what was only bounced around signals. Details were scarce, since it was all wireframe superimposed inside our HUDs. Tiny scaffolding appeared everywhere in between the rectangles. The image wasn't complete, a lot of angles were missing, with the armors only taking guesses at what might be and drawing those lines in gray. The image sharpened further, the large towers turned to something more familiar. What do you see? Wrath asked, having no way to see the wireframes inside Journey's HUD. Third-era skyscrapers. Kedra said with a hint of awe. An entire strata filled with them. I said, watching the map before me. They even have windows and floors in them. They functional. Unlikely. Isastride said, pinging a point on the map. Many of them are like that unfortunate one there. That skyscraper had collapsed at the base, leaning against another and ending up frozen in that position. A few dozen were like this. Additionally, third-era skyscrapers didn't have scaffolding that reached in between buildings like this. A tangled web of smaller lines had started to sprout from the mapping. Catwalks, skeletal staircases, and other scaffolding connected each and every tower together. Some of it had collapsed, others looked sturdy enough to support a few dozen relic armors. Closer to the ground was where the normality ended. Some of these buildings didn't have a base. They were floating far up in the air, as if suspended by all the connected catwalks. What we need is there. Isastride said, pointing right under the vortex. One of the skyscrapers had collapsed down, making a bridge between another, and directly through it was a hole. Right above where our vortex of water funneled down. Your might forge crashed through that structure, and is either stuck inside, or passed clear through. More importantly, the roof of one of these skyscrapers is close enough that we could rappel down and keep a way back up. This is a weak point. Father said over the comms. Tuovilus will seek to cut off any return. He could appear and slice off any lines left behind. Isastride nodded, humming. We need to leave a force up here that can catch ropes thrown up, or lower ropes down if the others were cut in combat. That tails nicely with what's needed. Winterscars, all of you, will journey down with the goal to repair Wrath. Fix her shell enough that she can begin repairs on herself, withdraw immediately after. The rest of the clan knights will remain here and hold this ground for extraction. Before I could ask who he was going to hold ground against, the comms clicked. Shadow Song to ground force. Enemy spotted. Report. Isastride asked. The army at our heels is surrounding the chamber, unknown how many are in the tunnels, but enough are crawling around the visible level. They're not approaching yet, likely the Kurs are gathering forces still. Our commander hummed again. They're regrouping before another push. All units, cycle through rations while we can. Once the fighting starts again, it won't end until they're all dead or we are. Isastride's helmet turned my way, a hand reaching out to my shoulder reassuringly. The army Tuovilus had called for is here. We've had a few engagements with them already, which slowed our path down. It is a true army this time around, not scraps left behind like what you've found here. I'll organize a defense, and hold the sanctuary chamber. Once Wrath is repaired, return and toss hooks up, we'll lift you out. If your own hooks are destroyed in combat, we'll keep a reserve here ready to deploy. Can you hold against a full machine army? Kedra asked. Isastride chuckled. A few months past, I would have considered such a feat as impossible. Lately, the impossible has been rather within reach. A single knight would be overwhelmed with numbers. We aren't running as single knights, or anything close to ordinary any longer. We have terrain to prevent surrounds, weapons that could kill even feathers, and the speed to match one. And they don't have any feathers left up here. Leave the chamber to us. He rose to a full height, searching through the gathered knights. All units. The Winterscar knights will continue the mission into the lower strata. The rest of us will remain here to hold off the machines. Our main priority will be to eliminate any drakes they have. We'll form up an assassination squad for this task. Rest of you will be on layered defense. Why the drakes? I asked, watching as the knights around all began to flow through practiced motions. Dividing into smaller teams, each taking tunnels and splitting the manpower. A group of 5 were already vanishing into the darkness of one. The single enemy unit that poses a true threat to our knights. As good as we are, it's unlikely we'll be able to kill an entire army of machines by ourselves anytime soon, even with our advantages. He said. It'll be a war of attrition up here. Bullet will run out. Medical supplies will eventually be consumed. Nightbreakers will be saved up and used for the more deadly enemies. Each minute spent increases the odds of a drake finding a vulnerable moment, and they'll only need one. That's not the part that worries me, we can counter this with sufficient tactics and scouting. The issue is that relic armors cannot outrun drakes. You want to secure an escape should anything go wrong. And the drakes need to be all killed for that to happen. Kedra finished. Isastride gave the hand sign for a grin. We'll have them eliminated within the first hour of combat. They can't hide from us forever. Once you return, we can execute a fighting retreat with little worry of being overwhelmed. What happens if we don't return at all? There's no signals that could breach through that whirlpool of metal scraps and water. It had already taken a good while for the armors to even pierce what was on the other side. If we died down there, they'd never know up here. Should that happen, then I suppose we'll actually have enough time to break the machine army and grind it down to the last. He took a step to the whirlpool and looked down through it. Move swiftly like the wines on white. We'll keep the way home open for you, until you return. Don't make me go down there looking for your body. I took my own step to the edge, watching the whirlpool before me, leading down into another world. Where Captain Sagrius had been cast down into. where a possible machine army was rushing to ambush my knights, my sister, and myself. Where the Might Forge was waiting to be bargained with for a miracle. The water churned around, uncaring. Trying to drag all of us with it. Down where Tuovilus was waiting for the last battle. Book 4, Chapter 43, Into the Breach. The other knights around us carefully continued their work, checking their lines and verifying they had ammunition and weapons ready for what came next. 2 clan knights came near them, handing over long-barreled rifles, snipers. The handover was quick, ammunition and straps passed over. Kedra's request. Along with landmines, traps, explosives, and anything else the surface knights had brought with them in hover sleds. Planner in question took a step to my side, helmet turned to give me a meaningful stare where I'd been sitting, chewing on the last bit of a ration bar. "I'll be fine," I said, waving her away. "Wrath strapped in, and I've got a small list of ideas to try out. You nearly died several times thus far. You should stay here with the rest of the soldiers." As Isastride said, without facing Avilis, they're only fighting standard machines here. With this many knights holding a fortified position, they'll grind down the entire machine army given enough time. I can carry the feather down to be repaired with the other knights. The safest place for you is here. She was serious about her offer. I sent her the hand sign for a smile. "If it was you that had to stay behind and watch me go down, would you?" "No," she said, realizing my point with a sigh. "No, I suppose I wouldn't allow you to go into such a thing alone." "Well, there's your answer. Times have changed, Winterscars stick together now, right?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "That's nothing new. They were very fond of keeping their friends close, and enemies closer. What's changed is the amount of backstabbing. Finish your food. We need to be ready the moment the scouts find a path. Just need explosives, then I'm good to go," I said, chomping down on the last bite before standing back up, grabbing more equipment from the hover sleds. Had a whole selection to pick from. Smoke, detonation, even a flashbang. Didn't hold out a lot of hope for that last one. My own armor would adjust to the light exposure near instantly. Avilis would be the same. But a split second might be the difference between life or death. Comms clicked, just in time. "Tempest to team, found an egress point that fits the requirements. Sending location now." The Winterscar knights all stood straighter, helmets turning to Kedra. Showtime it seemed. I swallowed one last bite, took a long sip of water and slapped my helmet back on. The whirlpool waited at our feet, daring anyone to go through the other side. So our group turned away and started on a quick jog into the temple tunnels again. Isastride's plan in this case. In the past, the only way down to the second strata from the temple was the center point, where gravity was warped enough to let someone drift down gently to the desert ground below. Problem: Avilis would have every gun pointed directly at the whirlpool. Not a lot of ways to sneak through an obvious choke point. But that cut 2 ways. If he's watching the whirlpool, he's not watching elsewhere. Desert's gone now, mites. Which meant the game's changed. Just like there were plenty of cracks to sneak inside the temple from the top level, those same cracks would appear on the bottom. It would have been a dead-end drop a mile down into a desert. Today we just needed to survive a drop to some rooftop, preferably one far enough away to let us sneak around whatever cordon he had set up. Plenty of spots were marked on the ever-expanding map the surface knights were making as they prepared for their own holdout fight. What ended up being the crack in the ground wasn't exactly might-made. Scout teams had been pinging the lower strata from every hole they could stick their heads through, so we knew where some towers were poking close to the ceiling. From there, we found a nice corridor nearby our landing point, and then persuaded the ground to let us go through with a few improvised picks. Explosives would have worked, but those were reserved for our good friends waiting down under. Also noise. Kedra and the rest of the Winterscar knights gave one last check on their gear, tugging straps and verifying rounds were secure. A round of quick nods spread through our team of 6, all of us satisfied, before we began leaping down one at a time, rope following behind as they each repelled and swung out of my sight. "Right," I grumbled, watching the abyss under me. Lately gravity and heights haven't tended to go well for me. I swallowed my nerves and took a jump down anyhow. A moment later, I'd crossed the threshold, and passed through to the world below. And what a god's damned fever dream this strata was. The armors and scouts had been correct about the strata being nothing but third-era skyscrapers and scaffolding stairways interweaved between each. Green plant life had found time to sink teeth into the area, moss growing on the catwalks anywhere dirt had slowly collected over the years. Most of the skyscrapers here still had fully intact walls of near pitch black, polarized glass, according to Journey's HUD. Other skyscrapers further in the distance hadn't aged as gently, only their spine and skeletal ribs remained. We'd repelled down in the shadow of a massive tower, hiding us from sight. Rooftop had outright crashed into the ceiling, as if the skyscraper was grown like a tree, and hit the boundaries of this terrarium. Where the glass broke, large roots took the chance to grow through, with offshoots of trees rising off as if fungus covering the decaying structures. In moments, I'd swung into a gloomy-looking level. Logy office chairs, desks, and rotting fabric cubicle walls. All of it slightly tilted due to the skyscraper having bent a bit. The first few nights were already inspecting the area, checking for dangers. We didn't turn on lights, neither inside the floor nor on our armors. Keeping quiet where our entry point was important. The last Winterscar night roped through the window, landing into the dusty floor, turning back to give the rope a few tugs. Up above, the scout unhooked the mooring and let the rope go free, returned to the owner. Ingress successful. Kedra reported. No signs of machines on our entry. We're beginning operations. Copy, I'll relay to Isostride Actual. Winds at your back, Winterscars. The scout called out, then vanished back into the tunnel's contact quickly cut off. On our own now. As one, the group turned and began to move through the abandoned level to the other side. Mites had been pretty thorough in trying to replicate everything from a third-era skyscraper. Papers were everywhere, showing made-up charts and odd posters hung on the walls. A few labor laws written out that made little sense. The computers at each desk we passed looked like massive beige bricks, all of which had black screens, as if waiting for someone to sit down and begin a day of work. Even had a coffee machine we passed by. Covered in dust of course, it might have never served a cup in its existence. If it actually functioned and wasn't just a replica in looks only. The other side had just about the same view we'd seen coming down. Life really finds a way no matter where. Small clouds of mist gathered and swirled around between the massive buildings, the soft gust stirred by the whirlpool a small distance ahead. Droplets of water breaking apart as it fell, turning into fine mist. Bright red birds with long trailing tails flew in a unified swarm in between each building, swooping over from vine and tree branch alike, hunting flying insects or landing to peck at strange fruits and seeds. The Winterscar Knights had formed up, gawking out the window like I was. I'd heard stories about how different mite biomes were. Kedra said. I feel like it wasn't done enough justice to prepare me. The other knights were equally caught between wanting to stare at the strange alien sight, or keeping guard. We were in contested territory after all. Kedra shook her head, then pointed straight down, from her vantage point. There. That's where we need to go. Hundreds of catwalks, filled with hanging vines or other detritus, littered the open air between skyscrapers. Some of them so covered in vegetation, they looked to be sagging slightly, blocking all light under them, leaving the catwalks there hidden in shadow and free of growth. That's our way through. We'll use these to get closer to the Might Forge. Keith, she turned to me. Ask Wrath what kind of force he could have assembled in this amount of time. He hasn't had enough time to prepare for this field. Wrath said. The army marshaled above was where he expended his resources. Any forces here would be a few packs of screamers who control this territory, and perhaps a handful of drakes passing through. Another army near this sector could have been called on, though I suspect we have an hour or more before it arrives in any kind of numbers. She nodded at the answer, considering. Once we're within range, we'll split up. She turned and pointed at two of the knights, each carrying the long-range gear on their backs. Adres and Kier will find a suitable overwatch position. You'll keep us covered from range, your main targets will be the drakes. They have no shields and can be taken down by a single well-placed shot to their heads. If we can, we'll see if Captain Sagrius landed safely somewhere nearby and regroup. If we can't locate his signal, we'll need to continue the advance on our main objective. The group and I gave a crisp salute, and we got to work. Underscore 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 un. Catwalks were a rickety thing. Some of them were sturdy, others seemed as if they would break if a rock fell on them hard enough. Fortunately, we had relic armor, and those were able to verify structural integrity. A path was lit up from tower to tower, hidden away by the dense vegetation, and giving us the best way forward. It was easier than some of the stairs we'd taken through the towers. Mites did a lot of things with little oversight. Sometimes, the towers had functional stairs. That wasn't always the case. One tower just had a stairwell that featured rings of stairs, each connected to themselves, leading absolutely nowhere but in a circle. Those times, we had to rappel down until we found the next catwalk exit. Elevator shafts also worked well as means to go up or down the towers. Relic armors had no trouble climbing up shafts or jumping gaps. Given how abandoned the whole zone felt, I expected to stumble on dead bodies of past human expeditions. Undersider merchants who traveled through this zone, from skyscraper to skyscraper like we were, and made too much noise. Maybe remains of prior camps where they'd set down, tin cups used and left behind. But there was no trace of anyone having passed by where we have, making me feel almost more at home. Like a scavenging expedition at a fresh untapped site. We passed through the last catwalk, pushing open an old fire escape door and sneaking into the tower. Like all the other skyscrapers before, we snuck through to the other side of the office floor plan, reaching the window walls on the other side and looking through it. Above, I could see the whirlpool of the temple. Directly under, I got the first sight of the Might Forge. Or at least, a hint of where it might have gone. One massive skyscraper had broken apart at the base like Isostride had reported, likely decades ago. It had fallen over to one side, striking another skyscraper before grinding to a stop. Now it looked more like a slightly inclined bridge. Kedra raised a closed fist, ordering the team to come to a stop. "You should take care when traversing the ruin," Father warned, voice crackling from the pendant at my hip. He watched through Journey's eyes, seeing only the danger the world had in store. Such a structure should have split down the middle and collapsed down. It may be close to the breaking point already. "Long way down too," I muttered, watching what was under the skyscraper bridge. That drop went further than a mile. Must be multiple strata put together here. Like the elevator shafts here, only massive. Journey's HUD was analyzing the ruins for structural integrity. "We're a little too far away to get good readings, dearie," Cathida said. "My gut says that if the building hasn't collapsed already, time and those tree vines would have slowly reinforced the internal spine. It's held together by plants." I asked, a little surprised. "What sort of food are the mites feeding those things?" "Frostbloom could survive on the surface, so mite-enhanced plants might just be the new concrete rebar. It's the anti-gravity field under the temple," Wrath pointed out, which made a lot more sense. The field originated from the temple, it remains active even in the changed lower strata. The tower building is within the range. "So we could just jump straight down from here to the Might Forge?" I asked, after relaying her message to the others. "Theoretically speaking. Sure you can," Cathida said. "Assuming you want to land on the bridge looking like cheese." "Drakes," Father clarified. "The feather would have collected enough in the area to target anyone passing through the whirlpool. He would be a fool not to. In midair, your evasion options are limited." "By limited, he means non-existent," Cathida corrected. "My advice, take a longer way down where you have footing to work with. You snuck in this far, use the rest of it." "How are we going to deal with hiding drakes?" Kedra pointed to two knights behind us. They nodded back, each carrying the heavier sniper rifles we'd brought down. "We draw the enemy out. Adris and Kier have the weaponry needed to eliminate them, they just need a bead." She then pointed at the bridge face. "Father's sight lets him see the beams before they strike, assuming the shot is fatal. So long as we have Father nearby, we can survive being attacked." "Are you certain two knights will be enough to take on two of Alyssa's drakes?" "A single knight with a good position should have enough ammunition and opportunity to eliminate dozens," Kedra said, without any doubt in her voice. "I've had personal experience with their kind during the Undersider City War, I'm sure you well remember that." "I'm aware," Wrath said, "you eliminated every Drake unit under my command. But why leave a second if you are confident a single knight is enough?" "A single knight could be overwhelmed by screamers. But Avalus won't have enough to overwhelm two working together. Not with the numbers you suggest he has here. And if we kill him before his army arrives, it won't be our problem anymore, we'll escape up the strata and the army here can't follow. Two knights are easily overwhelmed by runners performing a hammer and anvil formation," Wrath insisted. "I'm sure you well remember that." Kedra laughed, hand reaching out to pat Wrath's head as the violet eye stared back. 2 Undersider Knights you mean? These are clan knights, and more than that, they're Winterscar knights. My knights. Her helmet turned back to me. You tell Wrath that I pick only the best to join my house. They can do more than just survive against a small army of screamers. The 2 knights in question didn't change their posture, or move at all, but I could swear I saw them stand a little taller. Kedra wasn't giving them lip service either. She fully believed every word said. I dutifully related all back to Wrath through the soul fractal. The girl sighed. Something on your mind? I asked. I used to have a functioning alarm system. It would ring any time I was underestimating Winterscars. I miss it. It was oddly useful. Situations like these, it would have reminded me to rethink my words. I stopped, then looked back at her sack. How, exactly, did you end up having to make an actual alarm for something that specific? She explained. In detail. It turned out to be a heated topic for her, imagine that. No idea how that could have happened. Book 4, Chapter 44, Lurking in the Walls. Descending down the last flight of stairs was a somber affair for the 4 of us left. The other 2 had split ways, passing across the catwalk to sneak through another tower with a better overall height. I could see their progress on the side of my HUD, still connected through comms. The list showed 7 names on my side, 6 green and 1 grey. Sagrius wasn't found anywhere yet, and we couldn't exactly broadcast a full search ping, not while trying to sneak around. Wherever he'd fallen, he was out of range for now. As far as the armor could sense, this last staircase was correctly designed. Sturdy enough to hold our weight, without any dead ends. The glass wall gave us a full view of where the Might Forge had fallen. And more details of the skyscraper makeshift bridge. It had ripped through the glass and structure of the neighbor, cleaving through the whole thing, until the rooftop struck against a black obsidian cube of some kind that had been wedged into the other tower, like a heart of some kind. Whatever the massive cube was made of, it was clearly more sturdy than the tower falling into it. Golden lines glowed dimly, visible even at this distance. The weird might-made cube was tilted, one of the corners exposed, while the rest of the flat plane angled down. The tower resting on top had come to an equilibrium of some kind, hiding the other endpoint under it. Know what that is? I prodded Wrath, pointing. Whatever it was, it didn't fit the rest of the scenery. Neither the colors of the skyscraper interiors, nor some kind of seed for the rest of the vines growing like trunks around the zone. It looked more cut off from everything, as if here only by chance. A might containment cube. Wrath answered. Inside would be waste material or hazards that the mites could not destroy but had to seal away instead. What's it doing here? I suspect the mites built around it, and as the skyscraper rose up, it carried the cube up with it. Is there any kind of loot we could get inside? She scoffed. Spent chemicals that will only decay long after the sun dies. Gravity singularities that cannot be dispelled, only contained until they run their course. Old battlefields so filled with contamination that the entire land was sealed away instead of cleared. So, you're saying there's a chance for something shiny? If she could roll her eyes, I think she would have. There isn't even a doorway included in those, you dumb loot-crazed human. And they are made of the same material might blast doors are, impervious. Have you actually seen what's inside of those things then? No. Wrath admitted, no doubt pouting inside her fractal. I am only basing my information on what is generally known among machines. Far as I've seen, machines don't know everything. She stayed quiet at that, now genuinely pondering if those cubes were worth digging into someday. We might agitate the mites in opening one of those seals. Whatever colony came through here, they didn't break down the cube, only built around it. If mites don't destroy something in their path, it must be significant enough. She did have a point about that. I'm always happy to piss off machines, but mites seemed like playground adults watching over from a distance. An authority level above the kids running around the hangar fighting it out. But not quite allowed to walk into the game unless someone broke the rules and piled snow down someone's tunic. Our group continued the descent down the flight of stairs, seeking to reach the bridge point. The path went fully across the entire side of the tower, turning down to repeat the process the other way again and again. The wall of pure windows that never seemed to end made me a little nervous. While it gave our group a full view of the zone and our target, it also felt like everyone else outside could see inside. Approaching the same level as the bridge soon. One of the knights at our front called out. We should rot. The building shook. The massive glass window before us instantly turned into a spiderweb of cracks as something rattled the tower from the base. And then the staircase started to collapse on itself. No, not the staircase. It was the entire tower that was falling down, taking the staircase down with it. And us for the ride. Oh, he'd set the towers to collapse. Can't fault the efficiency there. Brace. Kedra called out, hand grabbing a railing. No, we've got a delta out. I shot back. Right now, everything looked intact, but the moment the skyscraper hit the ground or another tower, the whole thing would fold up and crush everything inside. Including us. I wasn't sure armor could survive weight like that. Our team turned, only to have the wall behind break. Not from the collapsing buildings but from a far more familiar enemy. A dozen white armored hands cut through, howls coming out in earnest as they ripped apart chunks of cracked concrete. Screamers. And if they were here, that meant Evelus knew where we were. Gods damn it, he spotted us sneaking in. Probably had these very minions start setting explosives around the tower base. Father shouted over the comms moment later, Keith, block. A pulse of a cult occurred to my right and I got a glimpse of what came with it. Right through the wall, at full speed, the feather himself leaped through, an intangible ghost. Kedra screamed out my name, trying to leap up to my level, only to be blocked by two machines lunging for her. By the time she'd dealt with the fodder, it was too late for me. He materialized a moment later, soaring across the railings of the staircase, straight for my head. A long sword lit up in his hand, a single precise swing, amplified by whatever running jump he'd taken. I saw where it would connect, Wrath's throat. I cursed, bringing my arm guard up and behind my neck. Father's early warning and my own reaction speed was just enough to keep her safe from Evelus. Evelus changed his plans quickly, turning immaterial again, soaring straight through me like a specter. The moment he passed by, it felt odd. For a second the concept of his very soul seemed to connect to mine as he faded through. The fractal that housed his soul was as immaterial as he was, but the soul itself went untouched by the occult spell. And in the same way I could sense him, he could do the same for me. There was a sense of shock as he passed through. Before I could find out what had caught him by surprise, he was already soaring out the other way, occult billowing behind the ghost. He turned material the instant he'd cleared my armor, his free hand reaching out, directly for my chest plate. Got a moment to utter a surprised half-abandoned word before I was yanked off my feet and dragged straight through the window alongside him. We tumbled through the air. Evelus used his hold on my chest as leverage, pulling me closer, other hand swinging that blade again for Wrath's head, utterly single-minded in his goals. She squeaked out across the soul connection, violet eye staring at the approaching blade diving straight for where her throat would be. I sent a vicious kick against his stomach, forcing us to tumble further. His blade swiped above my head, missing Wrath. A cold pulsed between us, and three half-formed spectral arms leapt from my armor, each swinging my arm guard directly at him. Evelus snarled, pushing off with his free hand, turning immaterial as my own wraith struck through an instant later. That's about all we got midair before we reached the broken ground of the skyscraper bridge. He landed with all the grace of a feather, rolling, hand flipping him up as he cartwheeled back on his feet. I crashed like a sack of bricks through one of the unbroken windows, shattering it and slamming into the floor-turned wall chest first, the edge right under my armpits. Gravity tried to drag me right down the hole I'd caused, but reflex let me grab onto the ground before I slipped through. Groggily, I got a good view around me for once. The skyscraper behind me was slowly sinking down, no cloud of dust yet from the base. The rest of the skyscrapers around remained stoically towering over us, so Evelus must have had limited explosives to work with. Wrath and Father both screamed out warnings, and I looked up just in time. That feather was already sprinting my way, chain whip lit up bright blue and scything in an arc from my right, directly for my exposed head, a dark semicircle of death ending at my throat and wrapping around. Nope. I said and let go of my hold, slipping straight down into the skyscraper ruins. The chain swept right above my helmet, an occult edge missing me by a few inches for a second time within the last minute. Not a great omen. I fell through the ruins. It was slower than natural, the entire area still being under a lightened gravity, but a fall was a fall. The interior floor here looked the same as the ones we'd been trawling through earlier, only turned completely perpendicular. Floor became the wall I was sliding down against. Dozens of cubicle walls had held together during the crash, piled up with chairs and other office supplies that hadn't been bolted down. A 400-pound armor slamming through was a little too much for the old rotting things, even with the softened gravity. Most gave way and I crashed into them until I hit something more sturdy, my boot finding solid ground. Close one, dearie. Are you all right? Kathida asked. Gonna be one of those days. I muttered, watching as the dust and debris of my slide started to settle around me, bits of brick and metal clanging off my armor as they hit helmet and shoulder pads, almost as if admonishing me for having ripped a hole this far down. Journey's HUD showed video footage of the rest, Kedra and other knights still fighting off the machine ambush in the doomed skyscraper. They were already several levels under us, still rapidly falling down, trapped in the breaking building. That was the last I saw of them, the signals growing pixelated before turning black. The other two were showing clear footage, sprinting through floors and stairways of another tower, climbing up with every bit of speed they could muster. Any screamers or machines they ran into very quickly ceased to move, the two knights working in tandem to cut their way clear. Far above, in the light, I heard footsteps walking over crushed glass. Evelyn strode into sight, looking down the hole I'd fallen through. Soul fractals. He hissed. I should have guessed. No clue what you're talking about, buddy. Nothing here but the voices in my head. And dust, rocks. Maybe a few office plants. Please. I sensed your soul as I passed through your body earlier. I had thought you were using scraps, the limited fractals your current-day warlocks are known for. It seems I underestimated your knowledge base. I tapped my helmet a few times. Sorry, not sure I understand. Not fluent in asshole. Can you repeat that slowly? Where did you recover soul fractals? Relinquished has always been diligent in eradicating it any time one of your kind unearthed some variation. Green pings came from Kedra and the other two knights. Keith. We escaped on one of the catwalks. We'll try to reach you as fast as we can climb. Stay alive, we'll be back up there soon. I think, by the time you make it up here, I'll either have won or died. I said, honest for once. Evelyn doesn't strike me as the type that likes to fight more than one person at a time. He clearly heard me, given the look on his face. Disdain, anger, annoyance. You're correct, Winterscar. If you think I'll let you live long enough for your escorts to arrive, you are delusional. I lifted a hand up, and gave him my best finger. Talking big there. How about you come down here and find out if you can? Evelyn scoffed, rolling his eyes, then pushed his glasses back up the bridge of his nose, as if getting ready for hard work. Let it be known I offered you a chance for clemency once, and attempted my best to avoid bloodshed. He took a step forward and fell straight down for my head. I, of course, took the only appropriate heroic action and bolted off deeper into the structure like a pipe weasel in its natural habitat. Book 4, Chapter 45, The Long Way Down. The chain end slammed into another divider, ripping it into parts. An occult blast came from it a moment later, exploding the metal cabinet it ended up into. Shrapnel flung everywhere, colliding against my armor with a cacophony of sound. Journey didn't need to trigger a shield for small things like that, it was saving it for the harder issues. Evelyn was going all out, ripping apart anything I could stand on, trying to keep me off balance long enough to nail me with the whip. I fell down further, slamming against blessed solid concrete I could stand on. A bathroom wall of some kind, from the quick glance I saw looking down the open doorway behind my feet. The feather landed right after, whip launching out for my chest. My arm's healed lit up, taking the blow, sliding the chain up over me before it could wrap around. Occult ghosts flashed out at the same moment, trying to reach him. Evelyn leaped forward, spinning on himself, whip following behind in a whirlwind that crashed through each of my occult ghosts. Keith. His hand. Father called out, voice tense. I caught sight of what he meant. Evelyn's other hand, it came into view with a black familiar cylinder. The chain had been a distraction. It scythed out, low to the ground, forcing me to jump over it. Which was exactly where Evelyn had wanted me, helpless in midair. He followed the sweep with a pitcher's throw. Father's death sight bled into existence, 4 large arms surrounding me, hugging tightly around. But I'd gotten the warning just in time. The jump I made was low to the ground, twisting myself upside down midway, watching the chain scythe right under my helmet. My hand snaked out and grabbed the lip edge of the bathroom doorway, then I pulled myself down, letting both gravity and Journey's relic power fling me straight through. The Nightbreaker sailed right over me, zipping across the skyscraper ruins and blasting straight out into the void, where it faded away from my occult sight. On the other hand, I had seriously put one massive push downwards. The far end of the bathroom wall rapidly reached sight and Wrath and I collided against the tiles, causing a full crater. Surprised the wall was still standing even. Kick off. Right side. Father yelled out. I didn't question that, trying to roll only to find myself stuck. Wrath's sack didn't make for good rolling. My head booted up a moment after, and I kicked against the side of the wall, launching me skidding across the bathroom directly into a stall, my head smashing against a perpendicular toilet. Mites didn't get that one done right, it looked more like a throne than any kind of toilet. It also didn't win the fight against a relic armor helmet, and was left in cracked pieces now. A chain and zipped straight forward, the mace slamming into the center of my crater, digging into the ruined wall. The occult explosion followed a moment behind, doing its thing embedded halfway inside the wall. It had survived relic armor with a sack slamming into it, but the occult chain was asking too much for the poor wall. It ripped apart, crumbling down, revealing more flooring from this level, and far off at the end, broken window panels and the longest drop I'd seen so far. This fight wasn't going according to any kind of plan. The terrain didn't let me get solid footing, and if I kept going down, I'd eventually hit the dead end where I'd need to pick between falling to my death, or getting diced up by an angry feather. Anyone got ideas? I asked. Cathita. Father. Wrath. They were all here with me. He cannot see through walls. Wrath said. I know you humans have a secondary sight using the occult. It may prove to be the deciding factor. The girl is right. Father said. You need to use the environment against a foe like this. That's easy for you both to say. A lot harder to do when I'm stuck in a literal toilet. Didn't have time to complain more, Evelys was already jumping down. And I was trapped like a rat here, up against a wall. But he had made a nice hole for me. So I made one desperate dive straight through. My hands ripped off a smoke bomb and a grenade from my belt, tossing the explosive right at the start. It wouldn't do anything to damage either of us, but it would make an absolute mess of the area. And boy did it do that job well in an enclosed decaying space like this. The shockwave yanked me off course and ripped everything around it. If the shrapnel flying around the cabinets, dividers, and ruined computers wasn't enough to disorient, the smoke grenade that exploded right after did. I skidded another dozen feet down before my hand caught onto something, and I swung to get my boots against the roof, then blindly kicked straight down. Goal wasn't to get a good position. Evelys would chew me up 10 times over if I tried to square up. I wanted to hide. And the random kicks combined with desperate turns got me lodged into the side of a cubicle. No idea even where I was in relation to the ruins. I'd been moving and sliding across the floor and walls so fast I'd let pure instinct and reflex guide me, stopping only when I felt the smoke and destruction was fading off. For a moment, everything went still as rocks and debris finally slid all the way down and rattled out the bottom. Smoke still lingered, the grenade hissing away, caught against a cubicle wall somewhere far off to my right. I heard noise further away. The crunch of metal bending as something heavy hit it. Are you truly trying to hide? Evelys asked. Did you think buying time for the other 3 humans to climb their way up here would change anything? You can't hide from me. You and whoever is advising you, I'll find them. My forces are scouring the surroundings for him. Once they've got him, they'll swarm into the area and break your neck if I don't first. It took a small mental reboot to piece together who the advisor was. Then it clicked. His overdeveloped sense of hearing would have let him hear Father as a comms voice in my head, calling out excellent advice. So his forces were searching around in vain. The moment things settle, I'll be able to hear your breathing, even your heartbeat. I knew he was baiting me out, trying to get me to talk. Feathers had stupid good hearing, but even they had to have limits. Is he bluffing? I asked Wrath. He's got to be bluffing, you lot can't possibly be this ridiculous. Feathers are not able to hear heartbeats or breathing. Or at least, my shell was incapable of that feat. She confirmed. He's not bluffing that your sister and the Winterscar Knights are too far away to save you, boy. Father added, keeping off the comms and staying in our little soul tendril group up. That part, I'd believe. We're on our own. Plan hadn't gone completely his way, considering the armors showed green signs right now. Kedra and her 2 knights were still alive. But their tower hadn't been in the temple's gravity well, and it had fallen at full speed. That's fine, I wasn't trying to wait him out. From here, I think there was a chance to outright kill the bastard. He couldn't see me. But I could see him. The occult sight could see through walls if I focused just on the sight around me. And his attempt to bait out my voice had exposed his own general direction. Sending my ghosts through walls was trivial, silently surrounding him from all directions. Feathers didn't seem to have as highly attuned occult senses like humans did, and my educated guess turned out right when 4 of my occult ghosts leaped straight for him from different sides. He reacted instantly to the ambush, but I hadn't gambled on killing him with a sneak attack. I didn't need to move from my hiding hole, letting me fully focus on the occult. Now I was playing to my element. I was going to wear him down. His chain flew around, but the ghosts constantly refreshed themselves, leaping at him, slashing with those arm guards that had far too many occult edges to be safe to touch. The bastard was fast. Feathers could overcome human limits easily, but physics still had some laws they had to obey. Inertia and gravity put an upper limit to how fast Feathers could actually move. My ghosts didn't have those limits. I moved them like a master puppeteer, trying to go faster and faster. Matching his speed, exceeding it slightly. But there was one advantage Feathers had that I didn't. A growing haze of heated air followed behind his head anywhere he moved, dodged, or sprinted through. My ghosts could barely move faster than he could, because I was limited by speed of thought. Ovilus could see everything move in slow motion, letting him calculate exactly how to maximize his speed and minimize my threat. I'd been planning on exactly this. Let him build up a backlog. And then up the heat all at once. A fractal lit bright on my own hand, and in doing so, each of the ghosts equally had the same pattern light up in their palms. The look of horror that flashed through his features was priceless. He recognized it a moment before it was too late, as each ghost completed their last swipes, spinning around gracefully to point 4 hands from each direction at him. Fire roared to life, burning through everything. Unfortunately, he tapped his own powers and turned immaterial, letting the flames pass him. He fell through a divider as a consequence, then ripped it apart with a far more material chain, scything through the ghosts before him. Press the attack. At this rate he will need to retreat or else the heat sinks will be damaged. Wrath said, when I sent her a mental picture of my current plan. Father watched on with his own sight, carefully studying the enemy. Ovilus was learning some of my patterns, but he was still being harassed by 4 unkillable ghosts that constantly zipped through the walls, chasing after him anytime he tried to do the same. And we were in an enclosed space filled with flammable things with a pyromaniac hiding in the walls. The air was heating up rapidly, as everything was being set on fire. The goddamn ability of his is ridiculous. I seethed, as the metal weasel somehow survived against the odds. It's the bottleneck stopping me from actually killing that bastard. Anytime a ghost arm guard sailed for his shell and he couldn't block it, he'd go intangible. At this rate, he's going to outlast me before I get him. The brain fog of overusing occult images was starting to stagger in. I held firm against it, focusing. Focus your mind. Father said. The occult is nothing but willpower made manifest. Trying. I sent back. The dividers and general layout of the zone here were slowly getting completely ripped apart in the fight. Smoke was filling the floor, but both Journey and his eyes could see through that easily enough once adjusted. And Ovilus wasn't just dodging my ghosts, he was always methodically eliminating everywhere I could hide. Then I made a mistake. He got close to me by chance. My ghost struck at him heavily from one side, not all at once, but enough for him to notice somehow. I thought I'd been subtle in my attempt to push him away from my hiding spot. His eyes narrowed, then glanced directly my way. Found you, rat. He leaped straight up, turning immaterial to soar through the obstructions between us. I scrambled out of the way, jumping out of my nice hideaway right as the feather tore into it. It wasn't a direct hit, more an estimated guess on his part. A good one. But a guess all the same, and that gave me enough wiggle room to escape his assault. I opened fire with my own fractal of heat, pointed directly at him, a torrent covering his approach. He soared through me, immaterial, fading back into reality with a savage swing of his offhand. It sailed through air as I'd already kicked off the ground, sliding against the nearly vertical floor. The chase was on. I jumped from divider to divider, falling down a few, sprinting across others, kicking an old coffee machine backwards, launching bouts of flame to hold him back, insulted his mother, anything I could to distract him. Ovilus wasn't having it. He hadn't cared for being harassed from a distance, and he wasn't going to let me give him the slip again. I had to end my assault with the wraiths, the difficulty of casting those occult mirrors and moving at the same time had grown too much for me. I'd seriously tapped myself dry. Father called out a warning, but I was growing too muddled to hear it. A chain end raced for my chest, at just the wrong angle. I elbowed the side of the floor, letting me spin my arm guard around just in time to take the chain. Not enough time for me to parry it. The chain was held off by my arms healed, but free to wrap around to my back. It swung into Journey's shield, forcing the armor to trigger early. Blue flared out, crackling against the blow. Only saving grace was gravity and my current speed, pulling me down the floor this entire time. I slipped through the chain like soap in his clenched hand, just as my shield was near 17%. A heartbeat from breaking. That wasn't the only dangerous part of that weapon. The occult explosion hit a moment after, spinning me like a drodle across the floor. My hand blindly snapped out and caught another cubicle divider. The cheap rotting thing broke apart, unable to hold my weight. It did stop my spinning and let me angle my slide down the floor until I hit a bolted set of cabinets. I'd reached the bottom of the skyscraper ruin. It was just lopsided cabinets and the broken window grid before me. And right past those cabinets, were the broken shards of window walls and a mile-long drop right past. More than a mile even. I think this zone had multiple stratas combined. It gave me a stupid idea. With effort, a cold pulsed one more time from my core, two wraiths splitting off from me. I didn't have them go for Evelys, I'd need them for later. Then I swan dived straight to the abyss. What are you doing? Cathida screamed out as my hand reached out to grab one of the window grids, skeletal remains of the skyscraper's old surface. The metal bent slightly, but held. Gravity was still weak here, being under the temple. Improvising. I grunted out and swung my way forward with a kick, hand out as my feet dangled over the massive drop down. The grid that once held those windows was sturdy enough with the temple's aura, holding my weight as I swung from makeshift bar to bar. Improvise harder. She screamed out, Journey's HUD highlighting a red outline rapidly approaching. Evelys landed right where I'd been a moment ago, cabinet crumpling down under his feet, the chain already spinning in his hand. Violet eyes darted around wildly, looking for where my wraiths had gone off to. Then they centered back on me, narrowing down. He chased behind with a leap, running with precise jumps across each grid as I swung my way under, features dead set and focused. He was gaining, speed growing with each leap. Exactly what I'd been hoping for. Half-formed wraiths ambushed him from both sides, forcing him to leap down at my level in order to keep his speed, hand grabbing a grid bar like I'd been doing. A useless attempt, Winterscar. Evelys seethed, swinging behind me. You can't damage me in any way that matters. Yet. I admitted. But gravity sure can. My hidden wraith sprang out, slashing both ends of the bar he'd been about to grab. Cutting the section completely free as his eyes widened in realization. Didn't matter anymore how fast he could think or any of his occult scrap shit. He fell straight down, screaming in incoherent fury. Book 4, Chapter 46, The True Forge. He didn't take to losing nicely. My unhinged cackling probably didn't help. How's it hanging now, you rat fuck? Watching the bastard fall into the abyss was probably one of the most satisfying moments in my short life. Now I was finally on the other side of this, for once. Even better, the modified gravity slowed the fall down so that we could all properly appreciate the drop from grace. Oh, I'm sorry, did you lose your grip on the situation? I called out. Dear, maybe the bar was set a bit too high and out of reach. Cathida joined in, because of course she would. Poor feather, falling short like that. Best he could do was insult me on the way down. The traditional thing for a feather. Of which, we were both gleefully beating him to the punch. But Evelys was pragmatic. If he couldn't win, then the second best option was to make sure everyone else loses. He reached with a hand down to his side, and unhooked a familiar black cylinder. Round number 3. The last of his stolen rounds. I stopped laughing straight away. Hanging for dear life, off a groaning bar of metal, this wasn't the best place to dodge a feather throwing a nightbreaker at my face. If anything, this was the single worst thing possible. Motherfucker, can't you just give up? No, he hissed, then wound his arm back. Had to think fast. I grabbed blindly for anything I could wrap a hand around, Journey's armored hand clenching one of the cabinet drawers bolted down above me. The thin metal dented under the relic armor's powered fingers. That'll do. I ripped the whole thing out. Falling into the abyss, Avalus launched the Nightbreaker round as his final parting gift. It flew through the air, howling, and utterly on target. Directly at one completely exposed human knight, in the process of throwing a ripped-off cabinet drawer directly back. Not my finest idea. Or dignified. But so long as I was the one left laughing this time while he's the one falling down cliffs, I'll call the plan a success. The ruined metal drawer collided with the round midway through the air, which was enough to trigger the Nightbreaker chains. They exploded out, wrapping around the dented ruined metal filing equipment, cutting it into ribbons, forcing the parts to spin up into a cloud of metal debris. The whole thing started to spin airy, off target. It got dangerously close to me, one of the chains slashing through a nearby strut. Then, the chain stopped glowing, cut off power, and the round began to fall back down. Gravity pulled it, along with the ruined pieces of the cabinet, down where it slammed into catwalks of different types, bouncing off and falling further into the dark. Avalus slammed through a few catwalks of his own, ripping across multiple before one could sustain his weight and inertia. From there, he scrambled back onto his feet, violet eyes glaring up directly at me. There was only one appropriate response to this. At the end of your chain now too, Avalus. I cackled. Avalus wasn't happy. This doesn't change anything. He hissed, voice clear over the comms. A temporary stay of execution. I'll be back, and I'll bring an army with me. You're the worst type of X, you know. I shouted back. Even if you try crawling back, it's over between us. It's not you, actually, no, I take that back. It's definitely you. Cathita consoled me, voice tender. Don't worry, dearie, we'll find you a nice imperial girl to be sweet on. With less metal in her. And murderous tendencies. Avalus grabbed the handrails next to him and ripped it out with a roar. Then threw it as hard as he could in my direction. By the time the bent piece of metal actually hit me, it was going slow enough journey didn't bother triggering shields. The bar bounced right off my armor, falling down into the abyss. Realizing the futility, he gave one last snarl, shook his head with a deeper breath, then stared back at me, gaze going cold. I gave him my favorite finger again, but besides a twitching eye, I didn't get much else out of him before he turned on himself and stalked down the ruined catwalk, making his way to the next skyscraper nearby. He's not out of your hair yet. Cathita said. The silver scraphead wasn't lying about that. Fell down a long way, but he's the persistent type. I know. I said, lifting myself back up. Once I was on solid enough ground, against things more bolted to sturdy concrete, it was a lot better. Lot of handholds for me to slowly climb my way back up. And given my luck, I'm not holding my breath that Kedra and the others will arrive before he does. The rest of his machines aren't here, so they have to be all out there looking to pick a fight and bog down my backup. But that's fine. The main objective is what I'm after. Wrath. Father said, realizing my main plan. Yep. I'm sticking her into the Might Forge, and holding the ground. If I'm extra lucky, she's repaired before Avalus gets back up here. If I'm not, I'll have to buy the time until either she's fixed or Kedra arrives. Regardless, I don't need to lug around a sack behind me. No offense, Wrath. None taken. She said as I jumped up and grabbed hold of the bathroom wall, the bits that were still holding together. I would appreciate having my shell restored. However, you should only have the basics repaired, and then retreat back to the temple. Not really an option anymore if you think about it. I said, making my way past the ruined bathroom. Kedra and her knights are a full drop below us. I'm not leaving her behind. By the time they get back up here, things would be wrapped up. His shell must be destroyed. Father said. You will find no safety otherwise. Hard way it is then. Cathita sighed. I climbed up the last bits of rubble, my hand reaching up into the light, dragging myself up and out of the hole I'd fallen into. Outside, the skyscraper's glass walls were still intact, although had a lot of cracks. Roots and vines had grown through, making a dry moss surface filled with brambles and occasional black glass. Good enough to stand on. A light drizzle was coming down, watering the entire place. All of that came from the temple above, where the whirlpool frothed away, pouring water breaking apart into droplets scattering all across the zone. By the time it reached the broken skyscraper bridge I stood on, it was mere mist. Ahead was where the Might Forge had landed. We'd gone through hell to get here, but what lay before me was hardly as epic as I'd expected it to be. I was right about it not having sunk through the skyscraper. Oh, it had certainly flattened a good chunk of the tower, but whatever spine was still holding this whole thing together, a few thousand extra pounds may as well be an extra bullet in the airspeeder cargo. That's a mite forge? I asked. Then looked up, just to confirm the top of the temple was directly above. It was. 3 gods above, we actually made it here somehow. If that's your forge, you picked a runt. Cathita said. Last one I saw was the size of a cathedral. Don't ruin this moment for me, you cranky old bat. Please. Swear to the gods I'll make the mute button be the default setting. Might forges have various appearances. Wrath said. This one is a more powerful models. It is specialized in small-scale precise constructions, exactly what we need. Please inform the engram her worries are unfounded. It looks more like a tilted rock archway than some mythical might construction. She said, watching. Just rocks and fancy doodles. More rock than arch, and the opening was just a little taller than I was. Nearby computer monitors from the skyscraper had been dragged over and piled up all around it. There were even trail marks left behind some of the heavier screens, so those had to have been pulled to it somehow. How? No idea. Looked more like a hoarder's mess than anything. Parts of the temple were still there, including steps that led up to the thing. I took my own step to the edge of the crater it had caused from its fall, then jumped down. Small hop, slower than it should have been due to the altered gravity here. The moment I landed, the rock made it clear it wasn't a rock. All the lines around the archway began to glow occult blue. The center arch warped, light bending, showing a distorted image of the skyscraper rubble behind. All the screens around it lit to life. And all of them had a single flashing question. Offer, full repair. Chassis, feather, generation 14. Payment required, fabric sack. Quantity, 1, Homo sapien blood sample. Quantity, 3 ounces. Is it, asking for my blood? And the sack the silver bimbo's riding in. Cathita said. It's a great deal. Last time I met one of these, they asked my legatus for several tons of materials. Took my team a week to get it all together. Not like I wasn't going to accept. I took a step forward, boot connecting onto the temple ground connected to the forge. Closer to the rift at the center of the archway. How do I initiate the rest? As if the forge heard me, a cold pulsed across it again, and a nightmare stepped out of the portal. Stepped out wasn't the right word for it in hindsight. More like a few dozen insect-like metal hands sprouted out of the portal, reaching for me. And kept reaching, more arms and joints just constantly pouring through the portal with no end. I admit, there might have been some light dignified screaming. The forge didn't care, arms still reaching out for the sack, which was still behind me. A few more steps back, I gathered my thoughts together. Calm. This wasn't a machine like the ones following Relinquished. This was a far more ancient force, outside her control. I took a few more breaths, then undid the straps on Wrath's sack, holding it up to the grabbing mess of claws. What are they going to do to you exactly? I asked her, as they began to bite the sack, each claw clamping down on fabric and holding tight. The majority of this forge's processes are behind the gateway. I suspect it will drag me to the other side for repairs. Once there, I should be safe. If possible, I will attempt to commune with the Might Collective, if this forge has a direct connection. Kind of dawned on me then and there, that I'd fulfilled the mission. Wrath was where she was supposed to be. Took a journey of a few hundred miles, fighting off a machine army and 3 gods' damned feathers, but we'd made it. Evelus had tried his best and I'd won. End of the road. Are you going to be okay with this? I mean, I knew she was. She clearly knew enough about this. But there were a few dozen creepy straw-like arms all grabbing hold of the sack. They began to tug up. More and more arms grabbing, obscuring the sack under the metal mess, becoming more like spider webs wrapping around from all sides. I will stay alive, I will return soon. If I can bargain with the mites, I will see if they can offer me improvements. I've learned a few things from Tamari and your sister on how to demand things properly. If anything, I'll see if they can generate some additional straps, to replace the ones I owe you. Good. Don't let them bully you into agreeing to a fair trade. Squeeze them for everything you got. I let go. The arms all pulled her back through the distorted archway, and she vanished from sight. 2 arms returned, one holding a white pad of gauze and the other a small scalpel. They came closer and closer to me, waggling the tools in front of me. Yet. Calm down, you bloodsuckers, I've got to take off my gauntlets first. A moment later, I was exposing my free hand and lifting it to the forge. The scalpel darted down on my arm, giving a quick cut. The white gauze slid across the red cut, staining the cloth. Both arms zipped backwards, sucked back into the portal. Everything went still. That's it? I asked. All the screens blinked. A new message, repeated on each. Payment accepted. Processing. ETA, 1 hour, 12 minutes. 1 hour might as well be a lifetime to wait for me. Ivalice was coming for me, and I wasn't going to be anywhere near strong enough. He'd seen every cheat I had on hand, and he'd survived it all. I laughed. Couldn't help it really, the situation just got to me all at once. I had a feeling I wasn't going to make it all the way from the start. Getting here, despite everything and fulfilling my part in bringing wrath to the mites, that felt significant enough. But damn it all, I still wanted to live through all this somehow. I didn't want to end up a disembodied soul hiding in a pendant for wrath to pick up after she was done breaking Ivalice. A beat passed, and then raw fury ran through my veins. No, I'm not dying here. I hissed. And I'm not done either. A mythical forge stood silent before me. Capable of creating anything I could think of. Rifles, weapons, explosives, even relic armors. And given the price it had asked for wrath, I think this forge wanted to help. I just needed to ask it for the right things. I gently let go of the tendril keeping father and I connected in the soul trance. What are you doing, boy? He snapped out, instantly alert. If you don't have me at your side, you can't see fatal strikes before they hit. He's bound to figure out how that works, if he hasn't already. I said. He has enough data. And he's not stupid either. I can't rely on you for this. I can't rely on Cathita either. I know he's done his due diligence. If I bring her out, he'll have me frozen in my armor reusing to Ekar's own counter. And I know for sure I'm not going to be enough by myself. Any advantage is worth keeping. Quit with this madness, and focus, he said, voice sounding small and metallic now from the little speaker inside. You should be using this time to prepare for the enemy and lay traps. That's exactly what I plan to do. I took a step forward, and unhooked father's pendant, holding it in my hand. Then lifted the pendant, offering it to the forge. Once more the screens lit up. Query. I want my father back. The screens went black. Then text filled in. Offer, possessed discontinued cat full body suit. Chassis, heavy excavator unit. Modifications by user, URS. Quantity, 1. Medieval European two-handed replica sword. Modification by user, URS. Quantity, 2. Payment required, human fractal echo. Quantity, 1. That's more like it. I said, figuring the gibberish meant relic armor. The Might Forge seemed to agree, this time sending one creepy metal hand complete with palm and 5 fingers, snapping shut on father's pendant. It held for a moment, then pulled it out of my hands and through the gateway. Payment accepted. Processing. ETA, 27 minutes. I could probably buy myself a half hour, depending on if Ivalice stopped to gloat about things and how long I could get him to talk. Journey, put up a timer for 27 minutes. It beeped, the numbers appearing on the top right of my HUD. I turned back to the silent forge before me. I didn't say I was done. Query. I want a weapon that can kill gods. The screens went black. Only a flashing underscore was left. Blinking, white and black. Then text filled the screen. Book 4, Chapter 47, A Weapon Like No Other. Contact. Southwest Tower. One of the Winterscar knights called out from their sniping nest. Tallest tower they could find, best sight across the entire skyscraper bridge ruin. Had a full view over me, while I waited at the center. It took Ivalice just about a quarter hour to reach me. He made his return to the battlefield a spectacle this time. I heard rumbling in the distance as the prelude, and like the snipers had called, they showed up. Crawling all across the outsides, claws finding easy purchase on cracks, vines and rough concrete. Screamers, enough to cover the walls as they moved. At the base of the bridge, walking my way with steady cold fury, was Ivalice. Figured you'd get here faster. I said, standing up from my lotus position. Did picking up the kids really take you that long? The feather stopped in his tracks, turning an eye behind him at the mass of machines crawling off the walls and onto the bridge. I suppose the number I came with was too much to hide. And here I was thinking I was being subtle. Oh, I've got a master eye. Couldn't sneak an airspeeder around me. Ovilus brushed off bits of dirt and leaves stuck in the grooves of his armor. I've noticed. Glass was fracturing all across the bridge, as more of his army emerged in full from the ground. White claws ripping apart the vines and metal in the way, scorch marks across the white ceramic armor as they'd crawled through the sections still filled with dying out fire. The other side of the bridge wasn't spared either, screamers flooding over the black containment cube, crawling out of the broken concrete. Comms pinged from the 2 Winterscar knights on overwatch. Lord, you need to evacuate at once. This is far too many to handle, we won't be able to eliminate them all. Stay on target. I said. They're after me, not you. Right, Ovilus. This discussion is pointless. I have a traitor to destroy. He answered, a small haze of heat beginning to form above his head, right by that halo feathers all had. His other hand drew out the longsword. I don't know what you're planning, but if you think I'll let you escape, you're far off the mark. When I fight her, I'll make sure she's alone. Guess that means he's sending some of his army to fight you too. I reported to the knights. Can you hold them off? We're more worried for you, the ones coming are hardly anything compared to the swarm on the bridge. I stretched my legs, cracking my neck to the side. I can always jump off. I said, patting the hook and rope at my side. Wrath would probably never let me live it down though. Journey's shields were at 100 and I felt about as refreshed as I could get. A break had done me good. I unhooked the underside rifle from the holster, clicked the safety off and gave an experimental aim, making sure I could use the weapon properly in the armguard hand. Relic armor made it easy to hold, Journey's HUD showing a targeting reticle where it calculated my aim would land. The white sword flared to life in my main hand, and I took a stance. Ovilus didn't take chances, clearly aware I must have something up my sleeves. Staring down an entire army and deciding I'd fight it. Not something a sane human should be doing. He slashed his hand to the side, giving an unworded command to his forces. The screamers howled, and then charged forward from both sides, leaping out with claws extended. He remained behind, watching. Calculating where I'd try to escape. Chain ready to cut through any lifeline I'd toss out. Staying safe behind his army. Well, if he wasn't coming to me, I'd need to get to him. So I started a dead sprint. Directly at the wall of screamers baying for my blood. His eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. Even knowing something was wrong with a suicidal human charging into a full army of machines backed by a feather, he couldn't figure out what was coming next. In my armguard, held tightly in my fist, was a small mite-made cube of metal. And inside was a fractal like no other. I asked for a weapon that could kill a god. The mites gave me a weapon that could turn me into one. Within the small digital computer inside the cube, a 4-dimensional fractal was calculated and generated. The millisecond it was rendered, it began moving. Constantly shifting, following an invisible curve, a hidden set of chaotic logic. And then, even in the digital world of numbers, the fractal began to glow as a soul tendril sank into it. A cold pulsed around me, whipping the air, the cube glowing blue, light leaking through my fingers. Sparks of lighting crawled around my armor, striking out and licking the ground under me as I raced forward, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tapped into the fractal of URS. I could see it burning bright in the soul sight, almost a gravity point, drawing power into a vortex with my closed fist as the center point. The concept it held. One that was familiar to me. The world fragmented in my mind. Dissolved into an infinite amount of parallel versions. Each with a keith of its own, and each keith had just triggered some variation of that fractal. The same exact fractal, existing simultaneously within that small infinity of linked worlds. I hadn't exactly known what the tiny computer could do. But the mites hadn't given me some kind of nebulous weapon that could only theoretically kill a god if used right. They had to factor me into that equation. If I could use the weapon, it wasn't a weapon that fit the description. The little bastards hadn't given me any kind of instruction manual on it. But I had a strong guess already based on the name. Single use, cross-dimensional 4-dimensional inscription. Modification by user, URS. Single use, the mites had listed. Within the first moment my awareness expanded into infinity, I understood why. The fractal connecting all of us was unstable, constantly moving. The mites had calculated a self-correcting formula that would keep the fractal a match with what the true pattern should look like. But soon enough, the formula would deviate, the mites unable to create a computer perfect enough to replicate a true one-to-one version of this fractal indefinitely. I had until the mathematics crunching through the cube made the first mistake. Then I'd be stuck with a useless cube rendering the wrong fractal. I don't know how URS factored in all this, and the Forge wasn't in the business of answering questions. I either had a request for it to make, and the correct payment, or it wanted nothing to do with me. Fussy thing. And the demands were ridiculous. Wrath and Father got an easy exchange. But me? No, the moment I want to start killing gods, it suddenly turns into a demon offering power in exchange for everything I own. Even Cathita thought it was a little much. But it was that, or die. And from the moment I tapped into the fractal, for however long it could last me, I was immortal. Power coursed through the cube, causing it to rattle in my hand as dimensions wove and spun through the gate. A cult radiated off in a wave, strong enough even the machines ahead stumbled in their charge, the force manifesting as a physical pulse by sheer side effect. The infinite variations of me blinked. Got reacquainted with the feeling. Then we got to work. A small part of the greater whole immediately gave their life up. In their dimension, that Keith leaped into the wall of machines, hacking and slashing away alone. Rifle opening fire until it clicked empty, discarded. Nightbreaker round brought out and fired, ripping apart multiple screamers that had the unfortunate fate to stay in the way. They fought, arm guard and blade working in tandem. Each one eventually was pulled off their feet, held down and stabbed through by dozens of claws racking across journey. Others survived long enough to be caught by Evolus himself, the chain scything through his own forces, striking and wrapping around until it cut through Journey's shield and then that Keith vanished from the greater whole. And in each one of those doomed dead-end dimensions, the fractal of mirrors remained lit bright, deep inside the armor until the very last breath. One image was sent out, but not within that dimension. For every 100 Keiths, we picked one dimension as the true path forward. Like before, it felt as if I had trimmed nails or peeled off dead skin. The whole survived, even while 100-fold versions of me didn't. But the result couldn't be argued with. The moment I tapped into the fractal of URS, 100 wraiths stepped out of my armor, and leaped forward against the wall of screamers. Each had a single dedicated Keith commanding it, for however long that Keith stayed alive before his dimensions Evolus cut his life short, or screamers ripped him apart. Making each mirror image fighting at my side right now functionally free of cognitive load. Evolus didn't even try to fight back against odds like that. He went intangible, leaping back as tide of wraiths chased after, swinging swords, fire and arm guards all at once. The rest of the screamers before me didn't have the same options. The only choice his army had, was to grind against my own, and hope their might was stronger. They were ripped apart instead. I dove headfirst into the melee myself, charging forward, images of me fighting everything around, clearing a path forward with perfect teamwork. A cult flooded the bridge, shining bright enough to be seen for miles, washing forward from the cube in my hand. Among the infinite, ever-changing future, a massive amount of Keiths instantly winked out of sight. I realized why a moment later, when the parts of me that lived were the lucky ones that happened to evade a Drake laser, leaving melted glass pooling down a perfectly cut hole. So, running in a straight line wasn't a good move. Above, rifle shots came out, as the Winterscars began opening fire, catching the exposed drakes. Evolus snarled just ahead of me, watching as his army was utterly overwhelmed against the wave of wraiths. "This isn't happening," he hissed. "This is an illusion. A viral attack against my perceptions. You've compromised my head somehow. Then stop running and fight me," I shouted back, getting closer and closer. "I'm not real, right?" More of me died away, caught by the drakes. A smaller infinity survived and became the new true route forward. I dodged and evaded every shot the drakes fired out, timelines pruned away as new routes became the true path again and again. Long enough for the Winterscar Knights to spot and kill the last drake from where it hid. Just in time, Journey's HUD showed their combat feeds. Screamers burst through the doorways leading to their rooftop nest. The two knights promptly let go of rifles, and drew black Winterscar blades, stalking forward to handle the incoming force. I didn't have much time. On two fronts. Any moment, the quantum cube could hit an error and lose the correct pattern, forever split off. The sheer amount of power flooding through it had to be melting parts of it, section by section. Concepts of heat and destruction were starting to appear in my sight. But this cube wasn't made by fickle mites. This was something they made while serious. It was every bit of their combined techniques, as perfected as they could have made it. Redundancies clicked through, again and again as more of the cube weathered the strain and remained intact. The second front was the machine army. They were adapting. The infinite versions of me stuck in a dead-end dimension fought them off, but we were losing faster and faster across the dimensions. The screamers realized stumbling against each other wasn't working, and began to tighten up formation. A few managed to dodge my strikes, and follow-up attacks would knock me off my footing. From there, it was over for that Keith. Others charged at me with improvised weapons, ripped from the ground. It worked for a few. With an entire army of machines surrounding me, all it took was one mistake and that Keith would die. I made it work. There was an infinite amount of me, all working together, all unified as one mind. I was adapting as well. Each second I died a few thousand times and remembered every death. That kind of parallel training was turning me into a battlefield veteran, new tricks learned by blind luck, anything that let me survive just a little bit longer. It was a bloodbath for a massive part of the greater me. But in the few true timelines where I poured everything into, in those the machines were being utterly eradicated. The army of ghosts ebbed and flowed, dozens of images winking out each second as their controlling Keith was dogpiled and killed in his own dimension. More images surged from my chest as new branches of me emerged from the current one. It never ended. I could not be stopped. I lunged out at him, white blade seeking his throat with a traditional opener. There was genuine fear in his eyes as he fought against a night radiating occult, a few dozen images appearing from him each second. He still rose up, convinced this had to be some kind of illusion, and struck out with his chain, the mace going directly for my heart. By all accounts, none of us could have possibly blocked a quick strike like that. But some of us had, by sheer chance. And from that route, we continued. The battle between us pitted omnipresence against sheer unyielding physical power. Occult sparks from our blades and chains striking one another flashed out in the air, looking more like streaks of bright light, as they were sucked forward for the few milliseconds of existence. Sucked directly to the cube in my hand, curving through time and space. He killed me a few thousand times. But in the true timeline, I always managed a lucky dodge or struck back at just the worst angle for him to hold off. There was an infinity of me, all working together to make slightly different moves. One Keith would inevitably do the best and become the next main route. I fought the machine feather, blade to blade. His gaze changed from one of doubt and fury to outright fear. The fight was breaking through every prediction he could make, the occult around me strong enough even his own fractals felt the strain of its gravity. He hadn't made a single mistake. In all the infinite timelines, no Keith had been able to land a hit on him. But he knew it was only a matter of time until he finally flinched. Book 4, Chapter 48 Return. I split off a dedicated group of 10 images, letting them constantly harass Civilis. He fought them off with everything he had, eventually forced to leap away from the 1-on-11 melee with me. Landing a safe distance ahead, heat venting out from his sides. Funny enough, now in all the dead-end timelines, Civilis didn't immediately behead me from this point out. Seeing an army of wraiths all vanish at once didn't fill him with any amount of confidence. Instead, he suspected I was going to come up with something even worse and kept his distance. In the true timelines, those wraiths from all the surrounding dimensions remained, finishing off the last dredges of screamers, turning their attention back to Civilis. They crashed into him like a warhammer, following my lead. Whatever scrap shit cosmic space magic powered feathers, it was clear Civilis had tapped into every bit he could grab, given the heated air flowing off his shoulders and head. Vents on his back opened up, channeling further heat out of his shell. His glare intensified, focusing on trying to beat down the immovable stubborn wall of images in his path. His only hope at breaking free, was to kill the root cause of it all, me. Civilis twisted under a swing, stabbed out for one of my wraiths, and fought his way forward, seeking me out. I steadied my blade and matched him. Moment I got into range, a kick struck out directly for Journey's chest plate. I twisted to the side, avoiding the main blow, but got hit by a follow-up heel swipe. Other Keiths did better, but ended up in a worse situation for it, so this became the new main route, not because the other Keiths had hit a dead end, but because this was finally the point where I drew blood on the metal asshole. 3 other wraiths all attacked at the same moment, and each of them cut through. His shields flared, fighting off the combined occult edges of all arm guards, even as he twisted the chain around to dissipate the harassers. He'd taken a gamble to commit to an attack at the cost of tanking a few hits. Problem was, a few hits weren't what I was offering. And I wasn't using a standard occult long blade with one single cutting edge. My arm's shields had dozens of edges. That added together quickly. The wraiths dogpiled after him, forcing him to dance, duck and weave around at full speed. By the time the last image was destroyed, his shields had broken and one of my wraiths had managed to sideswipe a tip of the arm guard through his right rib cage. That weapon was paying me a clan lord's ransom at this point. On the other hand, that expensive kick of his launched me up and away. I landed hard on the ground, rolling, two hands clawing trails into the moss, a cold lingering inside, causing the trails to glow faintly. Didn't fall off the edge or lose the cube, thank the gods. If his initial kick had landed, I think I'd have been thrown into another skyscraper and been forced to abandon this timeline. The heel tap was manageable. Evelus snarled, leaping out of range from the images, chain scything through a crowd, opening up his landing spot. Back on solid ground, his eyes snapped up, glaring at me. You truly are a nightmare to deal with. Greatest compliment I ever got. I said, feeling genuinely proud. The last bits of screamers in his army began to run, probably at his command in an attempt to preserve forces. Sorry about your friends. I have more coming, soon enough. Evelus hissed. They'll regroup and return. A rifle shot roared out from above, and the furthest screamer running away was shot straight through the head. It slumped down, broken. A stream of follow-up shots came from above. The Winterscar knights weren't going to let the enemy escape. They'd wrapped up killing the last of their own army of screamers, completely unhelped by any kind of dimensional shenanigans, getting it all perfectly right in one life and wordlessly taking their old sniping positions back. Hadn't even heard a word from them over the comms, they worked silently and effectively, reading each other's movements and coordinating with the landscape. I left them to the cleanup. My job was to kill Evelus, and by the gods I'd do it. Every Keith was focused on that one singular task, sending all the images I had, barreling down. The quantum cube in my hand cracked slightly, power beginning to overwhelm it. Occult shone through the fractures, but the internal held. Time was running out, more cracks forming around, the metal straining. I just needed it to hold for a few more seconds. He watched the tide of ghosts entered a dead sprint across the broken ground, and made a snap decision. He turned, and ran. In most dimensions, the feather bolted straight off the bridge, diving into the abyss. In others where the images blocked off the easy escape with gouts of flames, he broke his way through into the floor and sprinted through the maze inside until he could reach a glass wall to break through. But in some dimensions, the images had moved in just the right places at just the right numbers to pin him into a corner, herding him around with flames. Where are you running, scraphead? I hissed. Stalking forward, pressing the attack. In no timelines did he make use of his invulnerability except as a last resort to avoid a strike. Not even to escape through the bridge. I filed that bit of trivia in my pocket, behavior like that meant something. The fight was frantic as I cut off his escape paths. A shoulder pad sliced in half. Knee plates diced. Another part of his chest nearly sliced apart. Even some fingers. Fire was thrown everywhere, burning even the roots around the ground. This was it, he was going to make another small mistake and be instantly sliced apart like so many of my other timelines had gone against his own army. His attempts to escape began to die away, as more timelines tightened the noose around him. As much as he jumped and leaped around, the images did the same, intercepting him, keeping him grounded, always one step ahead. And then the images vanished all at once. The field cleared. My connection to the greater whole, gone. A cold crackled around me, flashed and faded away. The fractal had broken. Deep inside the might cube, the little digital computer had made an error and deviated in generating the constantly changing fractal. It was over. Only junk data was being generated inside. And Evelus wasn't dead yet. You can't win, I bluffed, standing tall. I'm more powerful than you could ever imagine. Run off to your boss and tell her she better send stronger stuff than you to kill me. Evelus stared back, hunched over himself, having fought for his life and less than a minute from losing it. He looked terrified. Violet eyes watching intently for any movement. Then they blinked. You're lying, he said, as if shocked himself. Tone and voice patterns match. Whatever you've done, you can't do it again, can you? All according to my PL. That's about all I got out before Evelys sprinted right into melee distance. I answered back with my own desperate fumbles and then got slammed by a wayward mace end from that god's damned chain of his. The occult blast tossed me straight off my feet, rolling me over the ground. I got up just in time to deflect another scythe swing with the arm guard, pushing it up and into the air. Evelys was not going to give me a moment to breathe. I'd died a few thousand times already to that very weapon. I knew exactly how it could, and would, murder me. There were some predictable movements from him that he'd repeated hundreds of times across the timelines, but Evelys was a god's damn feather and I wasn't. The rat was doing outright cartwheels and acrobatics while I was barely holding on. I sent images after him, spitting fire, but those were fumbling attempts and his long sword dispatched them, flowing the motion directly back to his chain for follow-up attacks. He advanced on me. He wasn't moving as fast as before, nowhere as quick as he could when he had to slip away from the hundreds of images fighting him each second. Moderating his skill, aiming to kill me without further straining his shell. In desperation, I drew out the Nightbreaker from my back, leaping over another chain swipe. It had been used countless times across all the dead-end dimensions, but in the true path it remained at my side for just such a moment. Bastard outright jumped himself in the air to match, using his leg to redirect his chain, bits of occult blue winking out right where his boot made contact, keeping him safe from his own weapon as the mace end raced to spike me down into the ground. Forced me to abort any idea of using the Nightbreaker, using my arm guard to shield myself from the mace instead, and its follow-up explosion. I landed hard on the ground, still alive. Safety clicked off on the Nightbreaker with a flick of my thumb. I twisted on myself, aiming the weapon down range, only to have the mace end of that chain slam into the launcher, slicing it up to pieces, including the round inside. Bits of scraps flew off my hand, leaving only the grip and shredded skeleton of the gun. Journey. I called out, trying not to panic. Plan B, plan fucking B. Right now, right now. It's too risky, you've got to survive just a little more. Cathita whispered. You're almost there. You need to buy a few more minutes. A little more is about to get my head iced. I hissed back, leaping away from another swing of his chain. Journey's HUD lit up, a single sentence scrolling on my right. Releasing safety locks. Evelys was getting closer with each swing, and that usually meant the end for me in almost every situation. The chain could be held off at a distance, but when he went to pair it with a long sword in close combat, I always died. Loading predictive modeling. 3 more swipes of his chain, and he'd closed the gap. The third swing intentionally forced me into a suboptimal block, exposing my chest for a heartbeat. Evelys didn't miss the chance, the occult longsword going straight for my neck. It connected, relic armor shields lighting up to fend it off. Full cognitive engram, online. My arms and legs locked up as Cathita took over. She instantly parried the death blow, turning it back on the monster in one fluid motion. I dove fully down into the soul fractal, doing my best to escape the claustrophobia of being stuck inside an armor. It worked out. Wraiths came out in full force again, fully formed this time, as Cathita struck out, the long sword swiping through the air with practiced movements weaving the crusader stances and the surface ones. It bought me some time, desperately needed. Better, it was actually working. Gods above, with my 4 wraiths harassing the feather, and Cathita keeping tied up against his swings, it was actually working. Heat radiated from his chassis, from every joint. Cuts in his armor highlighted by dim red, illuminating from within the cracks. I wasn't in great shape, but neither was he. We slammed into him. 4 wraiths, 6 arms blasting fire, and Cathita at the center of it all. Evelys stopped fighting back, weaving through the attacks and gouts of flame. He watched, eyes cold. I see. He hissed, blocking another hit, twisting under a swing from an image, and turning into a wraith himself as a gust of flame lit through, rapidly returning back to reality the moment the air was clear of the flames. A remarkable change in skill. A moment ago, you had no fractal powers active, no form, only desperate attempts to survive. He said, twisting under another swing from Cathita, backpedaling, resetting the bout. You oscillate between power and weakness. As if going through all your trick cards. Unfortunately for you, you've used the wrong one. You can't dodge everything forever. I snarled out, my gut roiling with a bad premonition. I don't need to. I only need to last until a download is complete. And it just has. He smiled for the first time, then snapped his fingers. Cathita froze in place. Fractals within my armor all shut down at once, killing every image out on the field. I was thrown out of the soul trance completely, into a world of pain. Journey's voice rang out in my helmet. Low power mode engaged. Warning. Shields disabled. Familiar feeling, Winterscar? Tarath did a thorough job eliminating traces of Tuekar's combat logs. But I unearthed most of it over enough time. Including one specific fight against you. You've used this particular trick before. And my predecessor already devised a counter. It was hard to think. While I'd been hiding in the soul trance from the damage building up in my body, said damage wasn't just whisked away. Now I was paying the butcher's bill as I felt all the hits I'd taken up to now. There's only one piece of equipment I had that was still powered and working with the occult. My arm guard, which was held frozen by the locked arm. I'd made it specifically in case something like this happened. Time to use the emergency escape. I dove down inside the spare soul fractal within that arm guard, slipping into the soul trance, feeling blessed relief from the pain and ache of my body, leaving only a small enough tendril back to my body to move it around. Journey. I called out, struggling against the armor. Emergency abort. The armor didn't answer back. Every extra fractal was dead. Evelys took a few calm steps forward, the smile intensifying. Then staggered to the side as 2 bullets struck him in the head. The feather paused, then straightened up, glaring up at where the 2 Winterscar knights remained stubbornly alive, aiming their rifles at his head. Futile. They should know it's a waste of bullets. The chain swung around. He got shot again, unbalancing him. Instead of annoying the feather, he began to laugh. Fight, struggle, use every last trick you have, humans. Death is inevitable. Despair away. The Winterscar knights gave no answer other than more shots. Going through their limited supply. Buying whatever time they could. The chain began once more to swing. This time, no bullets came. The knights above had finally run through their entire supply. It had taken an entire squad of drakes, and the remnants of a machine army, but the last bullet had been fired. Evelys kept his eyes focused on the faraway sniping nest. Done. No, a voice on the comms said. Across the bridge by the Might Forge's hole, a single Winterscar knight climbed up into view. Book 4, Chapter 49, Lion and Wolf. The armor was nearly identical to the original Winterscar family armor, but there was something more to it. The angular curves of the plating just slightly sharper, looking more feral than any armor. The red sigil looked more like old blood dried out rather than a fresh coat of paint. The way the knight walked resonated with silent danger. Journey's HUD linked up to it, name appearing under. A familiar call sign. Ah, you must be the third. I was wondering where you were hiding. Evelys said. I've heard your voice advising him again and again, but no matter where I looked for you with my forces, I couldn't find you. It's a statistical wonder you've managed to hide from an entire army. I don't hide. Father said, walking across the bridge, closing the distance, drawing 2 long swords in a flourish, a twin halo of blue I'd seen hundreds of times before, only far longer than his dagger. A cold crackled around him, the shield fractals inscribed on the plate like all other knights in my house. Father passed by my side, armor somehow looming over me. Fine. Evelys said, as if he couldn't be bothered with anything anymore. What's one more human to the tally? If you were any true danger, you'd have been at his side fighting earlier. Father didn't answer, instead he began to sprint forward. Evelys met the charge, swinging the chain forward, mace end flying off course, before his other hand yanked the chain back to hook out for Father. With a side step, the mace end missed the mark, landing right by his foot, deep into the ground. Father plunged down with one long sword, directly through the chain links. His armored greave followed behind, down on the fanged tip. The mace detonated a pulse of occult. Father's boot stomped straight through the explosion, the fractal of shields lighting brightly on his heel. His other blade snaked for the exposed parts of the pinned weapon. Evelys screamed in panic, yanking his weapon back with every bit of power the feather had in his system. It was enough to rip the ground apart. And also anticipated. Father leaped with the pole, leaping forward, sprinting across the gap the moment he landed, the other blade readying in action to cut through Evelys as he soared directly in his path. Evelys couldn't go invulnerable. Not with Father keeping pace with the retreating chain, his blade still firmly lodged inside one of the links. Connected back to him in the end. And the feather had no shields, he'd lost those in the fight with me. His long sword snapped out to parry Father's, the melee beginning in earnest. The feather snarling with each strike, while father matched him, a silent opponent. Kathita had held her own against him for the short while she commanded my armor. With my added occult mirrors, she was even winning. Father was winning all on his own. His strikes were savage with fury, each powerful enough to ring out in the air. He swung the weapons faster than any man could, and with more force than any occult weapon should have been able to handle. Evelus fought back, straining his systems to the limit. The battle was one of survival for the feather, as father wasn't after a lucky blow or a surprise strike, he wanted Evelus dead, and every move he made was to tie down the feather's ability to fade away long enough for a killing stroke. A failed dodge forced Evelus to parry, and father raked at him with both swords in tandem, striking with each at slight angles to the other. The machine blade blocked one angle, and father flicked his other blade out of his hand, letting it flow with the current motion, wrapping around the flat of Evelus's blade. The occult edge cut through the unguarded flat, and Evelus was forced to backpedal further or be caught by the freely spinning blade. Evelus was left with a glorified dagger. He stared at it, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. The new shortened edge lighting bright occult blue. But failing to pay attention to 10-cent Winterscar was a fatal error for most people. The occult dagger flashed through Evelus's head, the feather just fast enough to fade away a second before that blade could cut through his forehead. He reappeared quickly, instantly pulled back into the melee with father's blade seeking out weakness. Air vented harder behind the machine armor. Whenever happened when he turned immaterial, heat didn't escape anywhere if what I was seeing was right. It remained trapped inside his systems, burning away at him. Evelus battled back against a flurry of surgical strikes, finding his chain once again locked. A swift kick in his knee joint had forced the feather down on the ground, where the other long sword stabbed straight down through Evelus's dagger hand, pinned him against the ground. Violet eyes snapped up, staring at father's own faceless helmet inches away, realizing the danger. A fractal lit to life on the relic armor, covering the entire helmet, looming over him. A torrent of superheated air and flame streamed forward, wrapping around Evelus point blank, licking past his neck, burning into even his chest and arms. He turned invulnerable again in panic, diving down into the skyscraper to escape. And father was dragged with him, connected between their locked weapons. Last thing I saw was his disembodied hand stabbing one might-made sword straight down as the two sank down into the skyscraper, like two condemned souls dragged down into hell, eternally locked into a bloodbath. The world went oddly quiet. Nothing but screamer shells and broken ground remained around me. Journey? I asked in the quiet. Can you unlock yourself now? Negative. It answered back. All right. I got this far, just needed to survive a little longer. It was 50-50 odds if father could single-handedly defeat Evelus. The bastard was a feather, that automatically put him above the pay grade of every single knight in the clan. Though he had taken a heavy amount of damage against my images and was at his limit with the heat situation. Father was a disembodied spirit of the greatest swordsman the clan had ever seen, piloting a relic armor without any limits to speed other than sheer hardware, and had full access to the occult the same way the rest of us did. Was that enough? I wanted to believe. But deep down, I knew I had to prepare in the event it wasn't. Father was still only one person. Feathers were in a different league, and our own wasn't returning anytime soon. Lord. The comms crackled. The Winterscar Knights. We're on our way down, hold tight for a few more minutes, only need to eliminate some stragglers. We'll get you out of the field soon enough. Hold tight. If you can, remove the dead armor. We'll cut you out of it if you can't. Sounds good. Don't worry, I'm not going to wander off this time. Swear on the gods. On my HUD I saw father's name go from green to orange. Damage reports returning. Integrity reports showing his armor slowly dropping, hits appearing in batches. Had to get off this bridge and crawl my way to the knights. After that, we could run around in circles in the world's deadliest game of hide and seek until Wrath was fixed and then hope she could finish off Evelus. Had to get out of Journey. Even now, even here, there had to be something I could pull out of my box of scrap shit. My head muddled through, an idea taking shape. I'd been used to using the mirror fractal within my chest plate, almost to the point it was second nature to reach out for it. Now it was dead. But my arm's shield still had dozens of small fractals inscribed inside, copies in case this happened. One of those copies was the mirror fractal. I tapped into it. It grew from the arm guard instead of the chest plate, but the results were still the same. The images moved to my imagination, not my reality. I couldn't move. but that had nothing on the images. The arm guard lit up, occult edge ready to cut. I brought it down with precision, right on my leg plates. Where the power cells were. Sorry buddy, I'm sure you understand. Affirmative. The armor answered back. The power cells on both leg plates dropped straight down as I cut through their moorings. One hit a raised crack and wedged itself between a ripped-up vine and a chunk of broken-off concrete. The other bounced a few times, then rolled straight off the edge. Journey went limp, falling on knees and then teetering forwards. HUD and vision going black, as the helmet turned off. It left me stranded in the arm guard, afraid of stepping back into my unconscious body. I knew what was waiting for me there. Pain and agony. My body was not in the best state, and I'd gotten first-hand experience with that. Problem was that Journey was offline for good now. Which meant it wasn't moving anymore. If I wanted to take the armor off, I'd need to do it myself. I grit my proverbial teeth and dove back into my body. The pain was there, reminding me of every broken bone and fracture in my battered self. I groaned. Okay, okay. Point made. Stop the hurt please. Of course, my body being a dumb sack of meat, didn't listen. Extracting the helmet was an ordeal. Fresh air felt nice, but everything smelled like burned oil. The rest of the armor was painstakingly peeled off with ginger hands. Far above the Overwatch tower, even without the helmet I could notice sounds from the tower overlook. One of the windows shattered, and the flailing body of a screamer was tossed off, falling straight into the abyss below. That must be the Winterscar Knights, making their way through the machine-infested towers. Couldn't contact them anymore, Journey was dead. Either way, once they got to me, I'd have that much more options. Sound of glass shattered behind me. I flopped my head to the side. Eyes locked onto a soot-covered hand gripping the edge of the broken panel. A moment later, two baleful eyes of glowing violet emerged, followed by the rest of the feather, and I felt my heart sink down at the sight. Of course he'd somehow survive and make it my problem again. Couldn't just keel over and die like anyone reasonable would have by now. Hey! I coughed out. Evelys looked about as put together as I did. Armor covered in scorch marks. Deep cuts ran across the plating, segments outright missing. One massive gash ran from his throat down to his torso, leaking black oil. The glowering hatred was new on his face, different from the old impassive gaze. I think I really warmed up to him after all this time. Behind him, the occult chain rattled up and out of the hole he'd crawled out of, slinking back into the feather's hilt. He dragged himself up, putting effort into the movements. What a coincidence! He said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger leaking through the edges. I'd been thinking the same about you. Unfortunately for you, I'm still walking. And you're not. For the number of times you've managed to slip right past death, I think you've finally run out of lives. He took a step forward, then staggered, an occult longsword ripping through his chest plate. Surprised flickered for a moment, before he twisted and ducked, just as the longsword sliced up. Father stood behind him, the armor looking like a barely held together mess. Synthetic muscles frayed in strands across the exposed plating. 7 massive holes had been punched through the armor, including one where his heart should have been. The pale blue light of occult fractals inscribed inside the armor were shining dimly through the holes. The longsword still moved, cutting up, speeding straight for Evelys's throat and head. The feather moved quickly enough in his duck, letting the weapon rip free from his right upper ribcage instead. A fatal wound for any human, and something a feather could easily walk off. The longsword redirected, falling back down on the machine like a guillotine, constantly seeking out his throat. Evelys was faster. He struck back, using his prior twist to slam an open hand directly around Father's helmet. The force of a machine easily overpowered the armor, lifting him off his feet, the longsword losing its aim. Father's helmet slammed into the ground, cracks of black glass radiating from the impact point. How are you still alive? How? What are you? Evelys screamed, then immediately flinched to the right, narrowly avoiding another stab from the longsword. He still held onto the helmet. His fingers flexed, the relic armor helmet breaking apart under. Then he slammed the hilt of his chain straight through the helmet, shattering it. The armor went limp. Machine eyes stared down at the destroyed armor. Searching. No blood? Where is the blood? There has to be blood. Did he vanish? How did he vanish? Mental attack? Hallucination. There was an unhinged crack in his voice as the feather muttered to himself, eyes searching through the shattered pieces of helmet. The armor moved. A sword stabbed straight for the feather's head again. He slapped it aside with his own occult chain, the move done on reflex and without thought. In doing so, he left himself wide open for father's follow-up. He must have realized it a moment later, violet eyes widening as his other hand tried to protect against whatever was coming next. Too late. The headless armor's other hand snapped out, grabbing Evelus's throat in a vice grip, squeezing, a cold crackling around the plated fingers. Book 4, Chapter 50, Winterscar read. A pulse ripped through the bridge, crackling across the relic armor, then faded. Everything inside father's relic armor followed behind, the lights shutting off internally. A white armored boot slammed straight through the immobile chest plate of the relic armor, breaking the already weakened structure. The feather's other hand grabbed against father's own, crunching down on the relic plate, prying it off his throat without resistance. Evelus took a few steps backwards, holding his throat, staring down at the destroyed enemy. He wasn't panting, nor did he look exhausted. Feather shells don't need to breathe. And still, it felt as if the feather was struggling to catch his breath from the very way he hunched and wobbled on his feet. Those eyes turned back to me. He didn't say a word now, likely the insanity of everything bringing him down to a single conclusion: no more talk, kill me as soon as possible. And I was in range of his swing. His hand snapped up, lifting the chain to slam the mace straight down through my head. Mid-swing his hand let go of the hilt, and the weapon went sailing off the edge, falling right down the abyss. We both watched it fly out of sight, his own hand still frozen mid-throw. He seemed genuinely baffled. Then his eyes switched focus to the hand, opening and closing it experimentally. It twitched. Violet eyes grew wide. No. He muttered. This isn't happening. Not after all this. Not like this. Those eyes turned to me, filled with chaos for a moment before lucidity crashed right through. Loss of his weapon was a setback, he still had hands he could use to murder me with. He started a dead sprint forward. The very second step he took, his footing failed, landing him flat against the moss and glass, sliding a few inches. More twitches came from him. An arm slammed forward regardless, fingertips seeking out cracks to dig nails into, then he clawed his body forward, cheek sliding against the ground while his eyes locked directly on me. Like a disease. Just like a disease. He rambled. Pushing himself against the ground. Standing back up. Twitching, feet taking shaking steps. You think I'm some easy mark? My shell was built for war, on scales your kind can't even comprehend. You think this kind of attack hasn't been done before? I'll rip you out like the tumor you are. I tried to move my legs, managing to push off against a thick vine. Sounds of fighting drifted from both sides of the bridge end now. The Winterscar knights must have reached the base of the skyscraper, and ran into more enemies there. Not sure how the other side of the bridge was also filled with combat, the two knights couldn't have split up on the way down. And I was busy trying to run for my life from a feather rapidly losing his mind. Got my hands on my arm guard again, fiddling with the internal controls to turn the thing back on. Got about as far as getting my hands around one handle before the whole thing was ripped away from me by a blur of black. Evelus had lunged forward in a giant feral leap, overshot the jump, and crashed down on the ground. He slid, out of control, hands flopping around, trying to snatch away at me and missing. Settling for the arm guard, before his other hand slammed a hole into the ground. He scrambled forward after me, tossing the arm guard behind, moving on all fours whenever parts of his arms or legs failed to do their job. The blade. Atias's machine blade. It was still by Journey's plates. My hands and knees pushed myself up and forward across the moss, hand reaching out for the handle of the white blade with a small stumble while the feather was having some kind of mental breakdown behind me. Said feather's hand finally crawled across the ground faster than I could, grabbing my ankle and yanking back. Then it let go before more damage could be done. I rolled over on my elbows, locking eyes on the blade hilt again. Hand reaching out. I grabbed hold of it. And Evelus grabbed hold of my ankle again. Instead of yanking backwards to draw me closer, he immediately threw me straight up, over himself like an upside-down pendulum. Falling right back down against the glass and moss himself with me. It hurt. And if asked where, I'd say just about everywhere. Wind was knocked right out of me, leaving me momentarily struggling to inhale. Whatever dregs of life were left in my body, a hit like that wiped it clear of my system. Far behind me, I saw the towering black mite containment cube, gold lines flowing around it. And on top, 3 Winterscar knights were fighting off a small army of screamers. Kedra. She'd reached us. Made sense now why there was fighting on both ends of the bridge. It was like some kind of insane race between the knights and machines, both trying to reach the center point of the bridge, but forced to deal with the other side. The haze in my head lasted for a second longer before I remembered I was still in danger. Evelus loomed over me, still twitching. Stumbling with each step. He realized there was no clean way to kill me with whatever system failure was going through his head. So he let himself fall down, right on top, one of his hands forming a dagger-like blade, aimed straight for my head. It stopped short a few inches away, twitching. As if some invisible hand had grabbed his wrist and was holding him back. He hissed, face morphing in fury. Can't throw you off the edge. Can't twist your neck apart. Can't even stab you with my fingers. But you humans are fragile. I'll find a way, Winterscar. He said, inches away from me. Land my elbow on your lungs, suffocate you with the weight. Break the glass around, let you bleed out from the cuts. 1001 ways to kill you. Just you wait. The demon can't save you. I'll have him purged soon enough. And then you're dead, Winterscar. You're dead. No soul fractal to save you. No hiding away. No one else to save you. I'm not letting you live a second longer than I have to. I grit my teeth, fighting through my own pain. My arm twitched, broken bones inside my fingers grinding against one another as I tried to lift. The arm groped around, looking for where the sword had gone off to. I knew it was around here somewhere. Found it a moment later, hand slapping down on the white hilt, fingers grinding against bones as they wrapped around the handle. Do it! Tuovilus hissed down at me, voice distorted badly this time, hand still shaking. The violet eyes widened in shock. He spoke again. The sword. Do it, boy. While I can still hold him back. Evelus hadn't said that, I realized. Father had. The spasms, the lack of coordination, the loss of his weapon, it wasn't the damage on his shell. It was Father, fighting the feather right in his own home. When his armor had shut down, it wasn't from damage. It was because he'd left it behind, his soul latching onto the only other soul fractal nearby. Evelus says. I closed my grip on the hilt, and lifted. The blade remained trapped to the ground. Wasn't strong enough. I put every last bit of effort I could, and it didn't move an inch. CC Canty. I coughed, still trying. Demanding my body to cooperate just one more time. Fingers were wrapped around the hilt, but the arm failed me, unable to lift the blade up. I can't. Evelus grinned wide. A bloodthirsty smile of a victorious predator. I win. He said, beginning to laugh. After everything you put me through, Winterscar, I win. After every card you played, every trick you pulled, you've finally fucking lost. The feather broke free again, straining back up, his fists lifting high up and slamming back down to crush me through my heart. Once more, Father held him still, the base of his palms coming to a stop right before my chest. Evelus visibly shuddered, fighting for control, tremors racking through the white armor. The fingertips wildly opening and closing, wrist trying to twist them down, nails barely touching the bloody undershirt. He snarled, twisting his leg to collapse down, a metal arm snapping out to catch his fall, directly on my left arm. Pain. Arm was crushed. Evelus laughed with savage triumph. He once more reached back, trying again to slam his fists down onto my chest, stopped again by Father. He fell on his knee, but this time missed landing on my leg. My muddled mind flashed through options, as the feather tried to kill me again and again. Memory floated through the haze. Of a knight holding a syringe to his neck, muttering a silent prayer. One arm limp, body broken like mine, but still needed for one last mile up. My good hand let go of the hilt and reached down to my belt where an old first aid kit remained. An updated version for knights. I'd packed it as just default supplies, never thought I'd need to use it again given the soul fractal. The kit fell down on the ground, and I scooted it forward, letting it slide on the wet moss, moving it closer with my fingertips. Evelus continued to shake, still held by Father's vice grip. Sharp fingers twitching. You are dead. I'll kill you. I'll kill you if it's the last thing I do in this world. I clicked open the kit. Not dead yet, I hissed, reaching into the kit and lifting off one of the vials. Thank the gods, a vial was so much lighter than a sword. I could do a vial. What will that do? I asked father once, a lifetime ago. I brought the booster closer to my neck, gingerly turning it the right way. It will trick my body into letting me move as if nothing was wrong with it. He'd told me. And now, I needed my body to move as if nothing was wrong with it. That won't help you now, Evelis said. Your system is too taxed. I can see it with my scans, there's not an ounce of strength left inside for you to use. I grinned, a wide bloody thing is my answer. Then spiked the injector directly to my neck and pressed the button. Didn't even feel the injection itself with everything else in my body, only a small hiss near my ear. The effects started instantly. Heartbeat increased. Lucidity cut through the fog in my mind. Warmth, oddly enough, started to spread through my body, as if my blood was made of fire. Pain faded away. And energy flowed behind. Scraps raining from above, power coursed through my bones and muscles again. My hand went back for that sword hilt. Grabbed hold of it. I pulled. It rattled, tip-tapping against the black glass. Then moved slowly, sluggishly. The booster let me go past my limits, but it was pretty clear I was already near those in the first place. Didn't matter. Sword was moving and that's all I needed. More energy flowed into me with each second as the full effects of the booster sunk into my head and arms. Evelis snarled, trying again and again to batter down at me, body freezing in place as parts of him fought against his control while others struggled to power through. His movements grew more frantic, more unhinged, as the blade tip lifted off the floor and took aim right under his throat. Where his soul fractal was. He was quite thoughtful to get this close to me, right in stabbing range. Bold choice. Violet eyes widened, staring down at me, as if he couldn't believe this was how it was all going to end. Then they narrowed. You won't. Chuckles started to come out as wet coughs from me, making the blade wobble a bit. Oh, I think I will. I said. I didn't have my connection with the soul fractal, but the sword didn't need it. I was attuned to the occult, even more so after having touched on the fractal of URS. I could feel the trigger lurking inside the blade. The edges lit up, the glow of blue occult lighting up between us. Evelis shook, rattling just a few inches above me. Knowing exactly what this blade could do. The demon. Where do you think his soul lays? Evelis frantically yelled, stringing the words as fast as he could, struggling against the invisible chains wrapped around him. If you kill me, he dies with me. My blade wavered. CC can't hold. Father said, fighting Evelis to speak. The sword, boy. Now. He's right. You'll die. I said, my voice clear of coughs for once. As is my right. He snarled back. Evelis will return and hunt you down. He must be killed. My time is long over, do not deny me this, boy. The feather's eyes were doing a mad dance, glancing back and forth between me and the machines approaching. Eyes growing desperate. I didn't have time to think things through. Not that the howling and screaming they were doing gave any doubt in the first place. Logic spun through my renewed mind and I came to a final conclusion almost immediately. The white blade stilled. Kedra and the Winterscar knights wouldn't reach me in time, it only took one screamer finding a way through. No matter what I did, it was over for me. But the machines couldn't reach Evelis in time either, I could kill him long before they could stop me. The other knights could outlast the machines that were left. And with Wrath rebuilt, they could fly out of here. So long as Wrath survived, my sister and the knights who'd followed me down to this hell had a chance to escape. Screamers and the common machines down here stood no chance against a fully realized feather. Only another feather could threaten Wrath. Another feather like Evelis. He had to be stopped. Was it ever really a choice? I was a knight retainer in the end. And so was father. When sacrifice calls, we'd both made a vow to answer it. This was our duty. See you in hell, Evelis. I pushed the blade up. Violet eyes seemed to outright boggle. The air above him hazed and shimmered. He was watching death cut into him in slow motion, from the weakest most pitiful jab in history. I could see him try to use the occult, and fail. Father held a vice grip over his shell. Not even letting him flinch or twist away. Gods above, maybe by being in a direct fight with father, Evelis had a portion of his sight. So he could see the very concept of death slowly digging towards him. No, No no, no, no. He screamed, shaking, trying his best to move anything. I'm not going to die like some misbegotten dog. The blade tip sank into his armor. I didn't need to do much of anything, the destructive edge was already burning through the metal like a heated rod digging into powdered snow. All I had to do was push with everything I had left in me. The howling came closer and closer. But I knew they won't make it in time. He'd already sent the order for his forces to ignore the knights and make a full rush to his side. If they could have made it, Avilis wouldn't be nearly as panicked as he was now. We were in the same airspeeder, Avilis and I. Neither of our backups was going to save us. The Winterscar knights would arrive too late to save me from the screamers, and the screamers would arrive too late to save him from me. The feather snarled and screamed like a cornered animal, still fighting against the invisible chains holding him tight, joints seized over. I'm not dying here, human. He roared, not here. The sword was heavy, especially with just a single hand pushing it up. It continued forward regardless, and sank into his armored chest plate with little resistance, only the flat sides of the blade grinding against the cut metal slowed my stab. He buckled, thrashed, and failed to break the hold. A cold pulsed again. Avilis playing whatever last cards he had left. The pulse of power was deeper, different than his prior attempts. I will never die. Power flashed out, fast as an eye blink, then his hand finally broke free, slapping the flat edge of the blade. It carved out the side of his armor, leaving a melted trail behind. My grip on the blade hadn't been strong in the first place, so the weapon rattled off to my side. I fumbled for it, only to see a white armored hand pick up the hilt and slowly lift it away. Not a single sign of any tremor in that hand anymore. I stared as he rose up, standing up tall, glaring down at me with an impassive face. The blade turned off in his hand. No more madness in his eyes, only control. My mind flickered through the events, finally realizing I'd failed to kill the feather and whatever he'd done, he broke through father's control. Or outright killed the old man entirely. I still had a dagger. He didn't have any shields now. And this late in the fight, whatever he'd done had to have cost him something or else he wouldn't have saved it for the last possible second. The feather brought his free hand up, opening and closing it, watching it work as if fascinated. Ignoring me for the moment. Testing the new freedom. Then he reached for his face and lightly took off his soot-covered reading glasses. They stayed in his palm for a moment, before fingers wrapped over them, crushing the lens inside into pieces. He tossed the pieces off to the side. My hand dove for the dagger. Now or never. His blade lit up at the same moment. Turns out, pitting a half-dead human against a half-dead feather wasn't a good matchup. The captured white machine blade slashed straight down on me in one precise cut. I didn't feel the killing blow at all. Drugs must have masked all the pain, so at least I had that going for me. More surprised to find myself still thinking at all, and looking down showed no blood anywhere. He hadn't slashed through me at all. Instead, he'd cut the strap holding my knife in place, then quickly flicked it up with his foot, catching it midair with his free hand, stealing the last weapon I had to my name. He examined the Crusader knife, testing the balance, nodding as if the blade passed some invisible test. Then turned it on in a flourish, blade spinning around in his hand, a wide pale blue halo. Violet eyes turned and locked down on my own. The colors began to shift, from violet, yellow, green, blue, and finally settling on red. Winterscar Red. Book 4, Chapter 51, The End in Sight. I think my heart stopped at the sight. Father. I whispered, so low even I couldn't hear myself. The machine fled. Avilis said, but his voice wasn't the feather's. Not anymore. He found no other recourse to live, but to abandon his shell. Leaving me behind. Holy scraps raining down from above. Father just hijacked a feather. He knelt down, getting closer to me. Red glowing eyes darting over my wounds, analyzing. Too much information going through this body's mind. He said. I can't understand it all and I barely have control over the system yet. Avilis is trying to detonate the shell remotely. I'm holding him off. Are you going to make it? Think I might. I said, then flopped my head to the side, where the howling was coming from. Don't think they're going to appreciate that. Avilis, no father, turned his gaze from me to the approaching enemies. Eyes narrowed. Their opinion is irrelevant. Stay down, boy. I'll deal with this. He said as he rose back up, voice still synthetic, but his blades swinging into position. He turned and strode forward to the approaching horde of machines, approaching the two knights fighting for their lives. My two snipers barely holding off an entire army. One the other side, Kedra and the other two knights were breaking through the machines with far greater ease. A third knight really made all the difference, or that could just be my sister. She was utterly ruthless. Father took a running sprint and leaped far above the fight, in the center of the machine army. The last dredges of the machine army Evelis had brought still locked in combat with the two Winterscars. The screamers looked confused, coming to a stop, chittering with one another. Then they turned their gaze at him and began to scream. Claws scraping at the ground, posturing. Father stood his ground in his stolen shell, eyes flickering left and right between the incoming enemies. Calculating. One hand holding the longsword, and the other held Cathita's dagger. The machines seemed to realize their leader had been killed. Or perhaps Evelis had sent commands to them from the safety of wherever he had run off to. The result was the same. The horde snarled as one and leaped forward, collapsing down against him. In life, Father had been enough to take on these sorts of enemies even while wounded. In the might-forged armor that had been his temporary body, he'd managed to fight a feather and nearly win. Now he was walking on the world again, not in a relic armor, but in the shell of that feather and all the powers that came with it. He strode into the wave and nothing but death followed behind his steps, blades spinning, moving as fast as a true feather would. His sweeps crushed through legs. His kicks ripped apart skull and chest alike. Attacks on his frame did little to no damage at all. They tried to race around him, howling, switching targets to try and reach me. He never gave them a chance, even throwing their own dead bodies wholesale just to knock them off course, or outright off the edge entirely. Lifting the monsters as if they were nothing more than loose ice to throw around. On the other side of the bridge, Kedra finished off the last of the screamers, one final machine head falling off shoulders as the body caved forward and collapsed on the broken ground. She didn't wait for the body to hit the ground, continuing her sprint across the bridge. Directly to me, sliding to a stop. The rest of the knights were behind her, rifles snapping up, aiming down the other direction, keeping an eye on the white murder machine crushing his former minions. She didn't know yet, none of them did. But they could tell something had changed if Evelis was ripping out machine throats instead of mine. Medical supplies were yanked out from small kits, applied as quickly as possible to different sections of my body following Kedra's quick orders. Pretty soon, it all grew quiet as Father stomped down the last screamer's head into the ground, leaving the Winterscar knights staring at Evelis. Wondering if they should start attacking the feather, but also not quite understanding why he had scythed through his own army and changed his eye colors. That followed an interesting time explaining things. Underscore 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 un. Tarath floated in darkness, memories and fragments floating through her mind. A spark came through her systems, connections returned between her soul fractal and her greater systems. Her eyes opened, both working again. Around her, the Might Forge worked tirelessly, 100 fragile arms surrounding her, guiding tiny swarms of black, weaving them through her like a tailor would a needle. She was surrounded by some kind of air-like fluid. Suspended in it. With no end anywhere in sight. A hand reached for her forehead, then tapped. Do not forget, Apostle. Thy first labor. Find the last of the previous cycle. Offer her the solution. A voice boomed into her mind. Only she may cut the ties that bind thee. Only she may see the message that carries within. The message? The message. The one the mites had inscribed into her soul. What was it exactly? She wanted to ask. But when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the forge at all, standing at the edge of the gateway instead. Her systems showed full integrity. Everything was exactly as it had been before, no upgrades but neither any changes. 1 hour and 12 minutes had passed and all she had in memory was a single moment awake, in which the forge shushed her like a fussy parent. Tarath stepped out of the Might Forge, a white heel walking into the world again. She didn't spend a moment savoring the feeling. The last she'd seen of Keith, he'd been preparing to fight against an army. Was she too late? She booted her combat systems back to full and scanned around herself, seeking answers. 5 humans returned confirmation pings from her sensors. All alive. 4 in armor, and 1 in a bloodied shirt, slowly feeding a broken armor at his feet, letting it repair itself. Keith. Kedra. The Winterscar Knights. They'd survived. Relief flooded through her systems, a weight lifting off her shoulders. They were huddled together around a small campfire by the foot of the Might Forge, waiting for her. And sitting by their side, towering over the humans, was Tuovilis. The weight instantly crashed right back down. Her wings stretched out and she drew her blades. Tuovilis. The feather looked up, blood-red eyes glowing, and Tarath realized something was very different. No feather would defy Mother with a color change from her theme. To do so would be heresy. And the humans looked too relaxed to be hostages. Something had happened. Wrath. Tuovilis said, shortening her name like the humans had. She felt the soft hairs on her shell rise up. Something was very wrong with the feather. Stand down, girl. The danger has passed. That voice and timbre was. Her voice recognition software rapidly churned through the possibilities and returned only one match. 10 cent. But, you can't be. I am. The feather answered, then waved her away. Later. His gaze turned to the one human without armor. Keith. He gave a cheery wave, fingers hardly functioning, hand and arm wrapped up in bandages. The grin was the same she'd grown used to. Who'd have thought that father would end up the most Winterscar of us all, hey? Borrowed a god's damned feather. Don't think he intends to return it any time soon, family tradition and all that. Keith. She called out, closing the gap. Weary of the situation, but not willing to let it get in her way. She was a feather. Restored to complete working condition. If this were some kind of trap, she could surely fight her way free somehow. That's my name. How were the insides of the Might Forge like? Just as creepy as the outside was. That can be discussed another time. She said. You need medical attention. Now. She crouched down, palm on his chest, eyes going back and forth between the human and Tuovilis standing far too close for comfort. Whoa, easy there, he wheezed. I need some pillow talk first. No talking at all. She hissed, and put a hand over his forehead, eyes furrowed in focus as a cold crackled around, lighting snapping across her wingtips. What have you done to yourself, you stupid human? Do you need lessons on general common sense? Do I need to sit you down and make it clear a human is not expected to move broken arms, you stupid, reckless, stupid moron? He started it. He said, pointing a thumb at Tuovilis. Well, before the new management. Also you said stupid 3 times now. I think that's a little uncalled for. Twice is more reasonable. Kedra shook her head, arms crossed. I disagree, 3 times is perfectly accurate. And I did not give you permission to speak. Tarath added, lifting the hand and muffling her human before he could annoy her further. A cold sparked around pale fingertips, sinking into the human. So much of him was just broken in there. All masked by some drug lurking in his veins. She corrected it all, taking her time to do a proper job of it. Violet eyes constantly opening to check around herself, especially watching at Tuovilis. Or 10 cent. She wasn't sure yet, but whatever the situation, every second she had to heal Keith, she'd steal away. She pondered how a human could have ended up in control of a feather's shell. Answer must have been with the pendant. Likely held close enough to Tuovilis's chassis, long enough for 10 cent to detach. Humans somehow had that ability to move around without the use of a unity fractal. Without a spare fractal to move into, only the feather's main soul fractal was available and a war must have been fought for it. Invaders rarely had any kind of advantage historically when it came to soul combat in past archives. Not without some way to slip past the walls around. But if there was one soul she could believe could smash through such walls, it was 10 cent. He'd broken free of his cage, he'd learned the defenses feathers used, and learned how to turn his experience into a weapon. Even with the unity fractal, she'd had difficulties dragging his soul away after her first disastrous fight with Kedra. Tuovilis must have tried the same thing, and failed to drag him out of his home, stubborn mule that he was. She still gave the whole thing a low chance of success, even with 10 cent's advantages. Something else must ha. Not even a second later, she was rudely interrupted by a high-pitched beeping from her alarm, cutting through her focus. Perhaps, it may be true then. He was a Winterscar after all, they've statistically beaten the odds time and time again. Keith flexed a newly healed hand, gingerly touching the fingertips. Never seen it done while awake. You know, if all of this saving the world business doesn't pan out for you, I think you could try out your hand as a spa attendant. Probably would work out for you. You'd be real popular in the clan. She stood back up and turned to Tuovilis. Or 10 cent. The other feather stared back. I have full control over the shell. Worry not. That part isn't what I am concerned over. I need to verify you are who you say you are, and not attempting an underhanded scheme. The captured feather nodded, then knelt down, lifting a plate of relic armor. Something from Journey. Machines cannot use any fractal not connected to their own soul fractal. Because you are frozen inside your soul fractals, unable to stretch out of it, to reach for fractals outside. The plate he lifted had a fractal etched on it. The shield fractal, used by all the clan knights, inscribed just about everywhere it could be scribbled on. The one in his hands lit bright blue, and then manifested a dome before it. 10 cent held the plate in his hands for a moment more, then tossed it forward. Tarath snatched the plate out of the air, inspecting it. Checking for a trap. Make an attempt to use the fractal. 10 cent ordered. If you cannot do what I did, then it's proved without doubt I am more than a feather. Electric currents passed through her fingertips, and the occult fractal on the plate began to glow. Nothing else happened, but she already knew that. The humans had to feed these fractals both focus and mental energy in order to trigger, all while keeping a connection to it through their souls. She couldn't do so, limited to only what was directly connected to her soul fractal. You, really are 10 cent. She said again. Logically, it was proved beyond any reasonable doubt. The emotional side of her was still catching up, still suspicious. Give me a moment to process through it. Tuovilis had been chased out. She was repaired, and her city had been evacuated in time. Keith was still alive and well, and she could protect him now. Systems filed through and processed everything with alacrity. Tuovilis knew she was a traitor, and so did 2 other feathers. The mites must have known this happened, and despite all this, she still walked out of the Might Forge with the Unity fractal still etched inside her chassis. They must have a plan of some kind for her. She could only trust them. For now, however, it all pointed to one single conclusion: there was no reason to hide her true allegiances any longer. She was done. Done with the machines. Done with Mother. And done hiding. She dove into her systems with manic glee, finding old settings that had never been touched but still available. A color wheel opened before her, and she shifted the hue selection from violet directly to a blood red. She hovered over the acceptance, realizing it wasn't her decision to make alone. I have a question. Tarath asked. 10 cent raised an black synthetic eyebrow. Speak. If you've returned to full duty, does that make you the House Prime? He seemed to think about that, before Kedra waved. By technicality, yes. There is prior precedent we can use for this. It happened once before, when a clan prime was considered dead on an expedition, and yet managed to return years later. Uriel Prime. 10 cent said. I'm aware of the story. Tarath was not. Kedra noticed the head tilt and gave a quick explanation. A song about a house prime that remained behind a might blast door with 2 others from minor houses, holding off machines. They were considered dead. In reality, they escaped the death blow. They had to dive further under the strata, living among the undersiders. 10 cent added. Building funds to pay for transport, city to city. It took time, but they returned, alive. The house reinstated the prime back to his position, if I recall. So it is thus. We know what needs to be followed. Kedra said, as if the matter was closed. Are you certain of this? 10 cent asked. I drove the house to ruin by neglect. I wasn't fit to be a prime. My only talents were with the blade. You have done far more for the house than I could have in decades. Keith shrugged his shoulders at the byplay, looking unbothered. That's what you have minions for, father. Delegate tasks you don't want to do. Then all you have to do is look menacing in negotiations and growl a bit anytime the other houses get puffed up about something. Kedra can still command the house, and you keep the good old traditions alive. Keith, it is a little more complicated than this. Kedra said. Well, for one, I don't think you have to give back your armor to father. He said. Don't think he'll fit in there anymore. What else is the complications coming from? Or were you talking about other things? Kedra sighed, seemingly abandoning any idea of debating the gremlin. 10 cent watched silently the byplay. Why? He asked. The unworded question behind the single word clear to the two Winterscars. Consider it a request from me. Kedra said. It follows tradition, precedent, and is the right thing to do. You've come back from the dead. But not in your armor, nor in your body. Only your spirit is tied to the Winterscar name. Having you return to your old position feels like you've truly returned to us. Tencent closed his eyes, deep in thought. Then opened it again, looking back. So be it. Though I leave the power in your hands. The other Winterscar knights all stood up, back straight, before lifting their blades in a salute, bowing deep. Tencent turned back to Tarath. You have your answer, why did you ask? I needed to know who to make the request to. She said, then brushed her wings back, folding them neatly behind her. I wish to submit a formal request to join House Winterscar. Book 4, Epilogue. The battleship airspeeder limped across black sands, leaving billowing clouds behind its wake. Panic fueled its turns, the crew struggling to maintain correct heading of such a massive armored behemoth. Tuorda watched the last moments of his prey, as it finally crashed into the ground, metal plates under the hull splitting apart as the whole beast came to a slow stop, leaving a deep scar filled with broken parts across the land. It had taken a few days to hunt down the humans here. To break their fleet of airspeeders. Constantly having to hitch rides on the lessers in order to repeat ambush after ambush. An awful lot of work. And now it was done and over with. The battleship had failed to reach its destination, the human fortress too far away to even know about the precious cargo this fleet carried. The Drake reached a large clawed hand and seized Tuorda, talons wrapping around him, lifting him up and dropping on his feet. The machine growled, head bowing in supplication to the feather. Your prey, great one. It ground out. Succulent flesh, charred and clinging to life still. NNNN, too far. Tuorda said. The Drake nodded, hand wrapping around the feather again, lifting him back upon his seat. Tisefit's raven had been his way of moving for the past 5 decades, working in tandem with her. The loss of it did not feel good. Drakes were far less comfortable, forcing him to constantly adjust his position in order to not swing in every direction. It would take a few years for Tisefit to have a new raven put under her name. They'd need to travel down, search across the sectors and make a deal with whatever feathers were in charge there. Or pay a price to the mites at a large enough forge. He wasn't sure which would cost more. Tisefit blamed the whole failed operation on their temporary boss. Tuorda had no idea how Tisefit could have done better, he'd read through the logs and events. Tuovilis had picked mostly optimal choices, including some risky guesses that had paid off. All it did was prolong the fight. The error had been in who his opponents were. That human had triggered enough fractal power to match the feral one shambling around the 9th strata. Even the machines and feathers down there ran from that human as part of standard operation. Knowing his boss went long ways to acquire more power, he wasn't surprised to find himself hunting down humans far away for some scheme or another. He didn't understand Tuovilis though, not completely. The eccentric feather had refused to alert Mother on the loss of his current shell, nor do anything that might draw her attention. Quietly fled from his old shell, making it seem as if there was nothing to be alert for. Just moving around. But without a shell, there was little his boss could do. An advisor role to capture Tarath perhaps? Tisefit, of course, agreed with hiding the whole thing from Mother, claiming they might be pulled from the mission if word of failure got out. Another group of feathers would be sent to clean up what they couldn't, and that would swipe away her chance. The less Mother knew of their failure, the more time they had to right their wrongs. Mother only cared about results in the end. A shame they had such stubborn pride. Letting another group handle the humans and Tarath would have been the more relaxing thing to do. He wouldn't find himself in the middle of nowhere hunting down humans if another set of feathers were on the job. Tuorda didn't really mind this, Mother tended to be heavy-handed. She'd struck him down once, when he'd been a new feather like his boss. He'd also been chasing after praise, power, and all that exhausting stuff. He couldn't understand why he'd wanted it, but he did know he once did. He didn't remember the details of that conversation with Mother either, more a blur. Schemed up something to do with the surface, and sent the proposal to Mother. Maybe his past self had wanted to smash a few human cities up there? What he did remember was that Relinquished grew more and more upset each time he repeated words, and then, well, things were more simple and clear after that day. He could always leave more complicated things to Tisefit. She liked to think and talk, and she could do it for both of them. It was a great arrangement. Humans in metal and gold ran around on the exterior of the dying battleship. The few turrets left were still opening fire upon the horde of lessers sprinting across the ground for it. Drakes put a quick stop to those, lasers lancing through each with little effort. No shields, and no speed to evade anything, they were quickly melted down. The humans fought, as their kind would. And they lost, as their kind should. By the time Tuorda had approached the massive ship, his forces were well inside and crawling around the interior, pulling out humans and working on crushing last resort resistances. Tuovilus was at the helm, sending out orders from his lair and doing all the other annoying tasks that had to be done when handling lessers. Scans showed the interior to be a labyrinth, filled with turns and rooms. His target was in the aft section, and Tuorda did not particularly care to walk all of that. "NNN, would be easier with you here," he sent to Tisefit. She sent him a paragraph of text as a response, most of it angry. Tisefit never had died before, always safe at a distance and usually the first and last sight Deathless saw. A few of those had tried to challenge her, knowing what weapons she carried, and some had almost been clever enough. At least, until now. She'd died twice in the past few days. The first death was forgiven, decades of successful missions had built up her resources. And the few times Tuorda had died in the past, he hadn't cared to have his shell rebuilt immediately, waiting out the months behind other feathers waiting their turn. Usually whatever killed him was equally killed by Tisefit in exchange, so there'd never been a reason to reforge his shell with priority. Dozens of feathers died each day, so Mother didn't seem to notice nor care, which worked out for them all. Or maybe she had noticed, but this was all exactly what she wanted to see happen. He supposed it wasn't bad luck, or coincidence. Those same humans had killed him, and the boss too. 3 feathers, all destroyed by the same band of humans. Like he'd thought before, the error wasn't planning. It was the humans. These ones running around, shooting rifles at his lessers, fighting off the borders with bullet and blade. These were far easier to handle, like normal humans should be. The Drake reached the first burning metal section, then lifted him off, dropping him at the foot of the wreck. He dismissed the machine, letting it go free on the hunt while he approached the sides of the grounded ship. Ahead was his goal, so hand digging into the panels, prying sections apart. Heat built up in his system, but without any active combat systems drawing power, his new shell was more than capable of handling such a strain. 10 minutes passed with little issue as he burrowed his way through the broken ship, walking across floors when he could, but otherwise ripping his way through walls. The next wall frame he pulled apart had the barrel of a rifle on the other side, shoved into the hole he'd just made. 6 barrels in effect, all neatly packed. They were spinning by the time it bumped into his forehead, causing him to push back a few inches in order to get a better view. It opened fire on him, full automatic, nearly point blank. The rounds peppered his head, breaking down into fragments. Yellow light and sparks lit up the room. "NNN," he grunted, debating if he should just continue to widen the hole or deal with the annoyance. The sound was what decided it. An annoying grating noise, it was not comfortable and difficult to ignore. He grabbed the spinning barrels as they continued their torrent of bullets, yanking the weapon out. The walls ended up stronger, the gun parts that didn't fit through were sheared off, breaking the weapon for good. He tossed the annoyance to the side. His hands went back to the shear, gripping both sides and stretching the metal. An occult long blade dove forward, directly at his face again, and Tuorda was forced to jerk his head to the right or have his shields take some damage. Then he had to take a step back to avoid the follow-up slash for his neck. The feather stared at the stubborn wall for a moment, contemplating his misery. He just wanted to get to the vault of the airspeeder, not deal with all this. It was getting on his nerves. His hand slapped the side of the wall, a cold pulsing through as he triggered the fractal of pull. Voices and shouting came from the other side. He slapped a second mark on his left, just in case. And then he finished prying the wall apart in peace and stepped through. He found 7 humans, 3 in metal, the rest in some deep blue and gold uniform. All stuck against the walls, struggling against the power. They would definitely continue to harass him if he ignored them. He could tell, these were going to be that kind of human. One massive hand reached out to the first human, gripping the whole helmet, and twisted past where humans liked it to be. Quick and low effort, especially since each couldn't move away or stab him with their sharp weapons. Shields couldn't do anything to that kind of attack either. The unarmored ones just needed a finger flick to the forehead, squishy things. He moved a little faster than he needed to, but the screaming was getting on his nerves. Gravity tags couldn't stifle those. Done with his work, he continued to burrow his way through the ship, crunching a straight line to his target. Word of his approach must have spread through the fighting humans, since pockets of resistances were far more organized and prepared to take him on from then on. Explosives, larger cannons, and even the unarmored humans were trying to swing occult weapons at him. Well, he had a hammer for such issues. He missed his might door, but Tuovilus had been quite clear he needed to handle this instead of returning to help like to suffocate. He'd been hedging his bets, making a plan in case he lost. A bet that he'd been wise to do since exactly that happened. Apparently, what Tuovilus wanted would only be transported once. After the humans managed to bring it into a fortress, it would never see the light of day again. It had passed over a few hands so far, but Tuovilus had tracked it down to the final owners, just as it was about to be secreted into some unassailable foxhole. Besides, the door was much more useful against Deathless. There weren't any of those here. He shrugged to himself, the hammer slamming down into another human knight trying to crawl away from him. Orders came through, urging him to go faster. Once the humans realized a feather was here, they'd turn to resource denial rather than trying to win. And Tuovilus couldn't keep the dying ship's communications scrambled forever. Soon, he no longer heard screams of terror or shock when he ripped through walls, so the humans must be aware that he was here now. I'm going. Tuorda grumbled as his boss once more demanded he speed up, picking up his pace from a walk to a jog. It was more effort, but he could use his shoulder to slam into and through walls. If he'd been forced to run, might as well make the most of it. The vault was a massive isolated system from the main battleship, with enough metal that even he wouldn't be able to pry apart with his hands. How Tuovilus had managed to infect a system that should have been sealed from the outside, with just proxy agents or digital attacks to his name, Tuorda didn't know. But he knew Tuovilus was as smart like he'd been before Mother got angry. The humans he found there were doing exactly as Tuovilus had expected. They were trying to break into their own vault, in order to destroy what was inside. A shame they couldn't open it up easily. Tuovilus had ordered it to shut close, and so it had. It was another bloodbath, except these metal-clad humans fought with somewhat similar speeds as the surface knights. Imperators, Tuovilus said they were called. Dealing with them forced him to tap into his combat suite, matching their speeds. A comfortable heat build-up he could vent at a reasonable rate. This deep into the metal battleship, there weren't fires so he could take his time. The humans here were wily, fighting as a veteran team. They'd clearly battled against feathers before, likely as backup to some deathless expedition. Even knew what kind of fractal powers to expect from him, working around and avoiding any marks he placed. But without their spell-casting heroes at the vanguard, it wasn't going well for them. They had no edge over him. It was their speed and skill pitted against his own speed and skill. He was simply stronger in both. There was nothing these humans could do other than slow him down. His hammer finally caught one in the chest and crushed the body into the vault's wall. The other continued the fight for a few more minutes before dying as well, ankle grabbed by Tuorda, body slammed into a wall, with the hammer swinging right after. Far easier than dealing with the knights that had killed him in that tunnel. These vault defenders were more stubborn, but not quite as vicious. Or as well equipped. The vault door itself took him a lot longer to crack through. Tuovilus could have opened it up digitally, but the humans hadn't been dumb. Once they realized the security systems weren't under their control anymore, they physically cut off all cables. His hammer quickly proved useless. And the drakes outside were still busy chasing down fleeing humans, too gleeful with their work to bother. Getting one here would be a pain to do. Tuorda yanked one of the tiny swords from the dead humans, turned it on, and began to cut away at the vault. The blade looked more like a dagger in his hands, but he worked with what he had. Small chunk by chunk, minute by minute. Slash. 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 The humans came back and tried to chase him off. 3 times. It didn't work, and now the entryway was more blood and guts than metal and gold paint. After the first hour of cutting, no more humans showed up. The battleship was now well and truly dead, its crew either fleeing the drakes, or dead inside as the runners crawled through. Light went off after the second hour, and Tuorda was left in the dark. It bothered him little, he continued the mindless work of hacking away at the thick door. To get his might shield, he'd spent months waiting in the same place, slowly and methodically scraping away any might that tried to climb over the door section he wanted. The new colony had plans for the area and he'd spotted them coming. They dismantled everything around him, but were unable to do a thing as he continued to destroy mites entering into his range. The mites had been quite cross with him, constantly rebuilding their little shells, and sending them mindlessly after him, trying to work, and refusing to leave until he did first. As the days turned to months, the stalemate had turned more amicable in a way. Mites were made to build around some things, to contain them. Sometimes it was buildings, sometimes it was waste or dangerous materials, and sometimes it was even living beings. He'd been diligent in destroying the little critters trying to work around him or on the mite blast door section he wanted, but anywhere else the mites were free to break apart, or build. So they'd done as mites do when dealing with an immovable obstacle. They cocooned him off, cut the mite door chunk he was after and left him to it. Even added a handle for him after he'd stopped destroying the tiny things now that he had his piece of mite-made metal in hand. Stubbornness acknowledged stubbornness. That black cube turned out to be harder to get out of than it had been to get his shield. Suffocate had managed it only because she knew where he was, and had been looking for a servant to hold off any deathless getting too close to her. What better servant than another feather? It was a good deal. She got him out of the box he'd been trapped in for a few years, and she got a shield in exchange. Her having a raven to fly him around was even better. It took 3 hours of small diligent cuts before he was able to thin out the vault door enough to break through. He ripped it apart, letting the tiny sword drop and turn off. Violet eyes now the only source of light. Inside were a few human treasures, computers, storage drives, and relics of different times. Scrolls in glass boxes, and even a human femur bone, gingerly held in display. The feather did as instructed, taking slow steps to the end of the room and walking down the small steps into the lower section. An armory of sorts, filled with golden blades, rifles, and cut metal plates with fractals etched upon them. It should be here. And indeed, it was. At the other end of the wall was a figure held up by one wrist, suspended like a prisoner. The other arm was missing, only a white scarf-like cape hung where the arm should have been. If powered back online, even in the current state, this would be the most dangerous weapon held in the armory. He took a step to inspect the damage. Repairing this would take some time. But that wouldn't be his problem. All he had to do was power it on. Violet light flickered across the remains, the systems inside failing to reboot properly. They continued forward, following blind processes, doing more damage in the process. Tuovilis didn't need those. Digital hands reached out through to ordeal and seized control directly, binding the repair swarm inside to his boss's command. Work began, the nanites consuming parts of the vault around it to feed to process. Parts of the hardware were destroyed from a stab through the head. Tuovilis being careful to prune away parts that might be problematic to deal with too. He was careful with others, wanting to end with the full power behind this shell, but no possible contamination from the prior owner. Tuorda thought it was silly. This broken machine would never regain sentience. It could only ever be puppeteered. His boss worried too much. He couldn't help Tuovilis with the repairs either. Nanoswarms had their built-in hard limits, and even Mother wasn't mad enough to ignore that. Only mites could contain situations like those. Which meant all of this wouldn't be a short assignment, not with the damage Tuovilis would need to slowly repair. For now, he'd need to stay here and guard the area. Tuorda paced around the vault, searching for a suitable spot. He found a nice empty wall, turned and slumped against it, system switching to low power. Hand slowly letting go of his hammer, head sinking back against the hard metal before dropping off to the side. Eyes glowing dimmer, then closing for the long sleep. Soon, nothing but darkness remained in the dead vault. But deep in that darkness, another violet eye flickered back awake. End of Book 4.